Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you had an enjoyable lunch. There was a sparsity of food to begin with, but I think that was resolved. I hope you found the morning as productive as I did, and the breakout sessions were useful. Certainly, Group 1 was chatting quite a lot about a number of things, and I'd like to ask Mark if he would like to give us some feedback from the breakout groups, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Normally trying to give feedback from a group that had as wide-ranging a discussion as we had over the course of an hour is difficult enough. Trying to do it for 4 groups, 3 of which obviously I wasn't part of, is going to be nigh on impossible. So apologies in advance for maybe not reflecting everything. But rather than have the 4 facilitators in turn report back on the discussion of their group, where inevitably we'll all end up saying similar things, we'll try and condense it all. But everything that's been discussed in the groups has been captured and a note will be written up of it. So if we don't make mention of a particular point that was raised in this session, it's still been captured as part of the discussion. In terms of challenges, in no particular order, the commonalities that seem to come across from the 4 groups were, how do we first of all build ownership within councils of the benchmarking approach? That it shouldn't just be something that sits with corporate services, corporate performance managers, but should be an active part of service management itself. It should be part of the day job. Someone, I think, used a phrase in one of the groups saying that it should be about managing performance, not simply reporting performance. So that we're actively engaged in decision-making and using benchmarking data as part of all of that. Equally, in terms of ownership, there should be a culture of openness and honesty. It was a phrase that was used, I think, in my group, that we should be open about what does the information tell us in benchmarking terms, but equally honest about where some of our challenges and problems lie as a result of that. And very often, as part of the existing culture, I think the discussion in our group certainly was that we typically talk about the misuse of performance indicators on the indicators that we don't perform particularly well on. We need to be more mature in how we deal with that as organisations and genuinely get to a true understanding of performance so we can drive improvement and be honest and open with the public about some of the issues and challenges therein. Resources was a theme, I think, in some of the groups, ensuring we've got the right skills to both analyse data so we can get to the nub of what is the data actually telling us about service performance. Is that analytical capacity there in place across all councils? There seem to be question marks. Some may be well-resourced, others may not. Equally, in terms of facilitation skills, a key part of the model, I think, set out by Andrew earlier, and a very similar model that we'll be using with Solace, is to have group discussion and group facilitation around, well, OK, what do we now do once we go beyond the numbers? So again, there was a question about, have we got the right kinds of skills to lead that type of facilitation within councils? And if not, where can we draw it from? Because it will be a critical component in the improvement journey. So questions around local capacity, local skills to actively take things forward. And therefore a question about what resources will come from national improvement bodies, such as the Improvement Service, but potentially elsewhere as well. What can they do to help support the process going forward and getting that organised to overcome that challenge? Third issue that came through from some of the groups was around coordination with other key performance reporting frameworks that we all inhabit in local government. And it's not about necessarily getting rid of all of them, but can we schedule them in ways where they actually work together so we don't end up reporting something in one framework and then a couple of weeks later, with a slight tweak in the definition of an indicator, end up reporting essentially the same thing to another vehicle. So can we get them more common, more joined up, more cohesive, more coordinated? And also underpinning all of that, more cohesive, coordinated data that supports it, so we'll not end up replicating for slightly different purposes the same data. Big discussion, I think, probably in all of the groups around politics and the potential for politics to overcome some of the challenges within benchmarking. In our group, we had a big discussion around, is it personality that seems to be the problem in a lot of local politics? And certainly good indications where strong audit arrangements are in place, strong scrutiny arrangements within councils, it can overcome some of the challenges of personality politics, where the focus is very much on getting to the nub of understanding an issue in a non-partisan fashion, and the council then have an important role to play in driving performance improvement, not simply the officers of the organisation. And therefore, data such as performance data through benchmarking can be used as part of an evidence and decision-making process And that neutralises some of the risk of personality politics getting in the way of improvement activities. And then lastly, how do we take all of this into an outcomes dimension? It was recognised, I think, through the 3 presentations this morning that that's a challenge. How do we now get this into the CPP environment? Because if we're serious about improving outcomes, CPPs and beyond are going to be part of the equation. Getting data that will support all of that will be difficult, and I know from personal experience the challenge of getting data sorted out for local government. It's been hugely complex and time-consuming. If we extend that into CPPs, I'm sure there'll be equally complicating factors. Other issues will emerge throughout all of that is, again, accountability and scrutiny. If CPPs are to be a forum for this going forward, who are they going to be accountable to will be an issue, and how do you scrutinise their activities will be an issue. Certainly the new proposed legislation will put in place common duties on community planning partnerships, but the accountability line of partners will be equally important. To whom are they accountable and for what is something we're going to have to try and resolve. And I suppose lastly around all of that, if it's still about accountability, public awareness. How aware are the public, not simply about local government and its performance, but certainly about the wider CPP? How many people, if we were to do a straw poll, would actually know what a CPP is? How many people actually recognise what community planning is? So again, there'll be issues around there in terms of the outcome focus about genuinely getting people aware of community planning, its importance, the role of organisations within it, and how benchmarking within that environment can help support and drive reform and improvement. In terms of risks, there's again a number of common discussions that seem to come up across the piece. One was around, again, the politics of it. How can we help politicians be part of this? We know there's always that element, I think as Clive was saying this morning, where what politicians have to do will slightly differ from what service managers have to do. That's just part of the world. We have to live with that. But ensuring that politicians are part of the process can help temper that tendency towards political game playing that may otherwise happen. Ensuring, again, politicians take a view of the long term here. Some of this will not just transform services overnight. How can we help politicians build a story of why benchmarking matters to them, why it matters to public service reform, so that they're behind the agenda as it takes time to bed in and genuinely drive improvement. There was a big discussion, certainly in my group, around priorities in that context. That what we need to establish as part of the exercise are clear priorities for councils and potentially for community planning partnerships going forward, so that benchmarking itself doesn't just become a T-shirt slogan. It's a priority, but within the context of benchmarking, what are the service priorities and the service improvement priorities? We need to be clear about that in order to drive the types of improvement activities that will need to follow from benchmarking. And then lastly, the biggest risk overall, I suppose, is the media, and I think that was consistent across all of the 4 groups. But it seems to be the overall tenor was, well, the media will do what the media is going to do and what it always has done, and we just have to roll with the punches on that and not get obsessed by it. It will be a short-term story for a period of time, and then we'll all have to go back and get on with the real job of driving improvement across services. So we just have to live with that tendency that's in the media and keep the focus on the improvement that needs to follow from benchmarking. Issue of family groups was clearly discussed, and I think it's fair to say there seems to be something of a mixed view in terms of family groups across the different discussion groups. There was a discussion, I think, in a couple around should, if you're having family groups, they be built around councils or built around services such as education, social work and so forth. And certainly that's an issue that Solace have wrestled with over the last couple of months and not yet finally resolved. Another tension that maybe crept into some of the discussion around family groups is, are we saying somehow that you're limiting councils to working only with defined family groups? And I think from a Solace perspective, the answer would be no. What we're saying is, at minimum, you would be part of one family group, but you will be free and at liberty to benchmark with others out with that family group. It's as much an issue of practicality as anything else, and I think that was something that was strongly discussed in my group. Can you get all 32 councils across all services together in a single room to discuss things? Probably not. Therefore, family groups are a practical basis for organising the kind of drill-down discussion that needs to take place beyond data to get to real issues of improvement and so forth. There was also a discussion, I think, in our group around good practice sharing. So it's not simply about what comes through from the data, etc., but getting into good practice models. And again, I think we were discussing that that's not something that will solely be the responsibility of the Solace project. There are already a myriad of other useful benchmarking arenas where some of that discussion is already taking place and will continue to take place. I see we've got colleagues from APSE, for example, in the room today. They do a lot of work around environmental and other services. That will continue. So again, back to Clive's point from this morning, there shouldn't be simply one benchmarking framework. There should be others at different levels that support one another. Big challenge, I suppose, in all of that will therefore be trying to coordinate between the piece. In terms of the indicators themselves, it seems to be the consensus was the balance was about right in terms of cost, productivity, service quality, customer satisfaction, with recognition that we're still weak on outcomes. But the key challenge going forward is to keep the framework relevant for improvement purposes. So that it has to continue to evolve and improve over time itself. And that there are issues and questions around some of the individual indicators. And again, the onus is upon getting those indicators right for service improvement purposes. But balance overall was deemed to be about right. How we then embed the approach was another big theme for discussion. Certainly from a couple of groups, there was a notion that we should be more fully discussing things with some of the professional associations across local government, not just with Solace. And I think that's something that Solace themselves have recognised and have set up now processes to ensure that that takes place. Certainly over the last 6 or 7 months, directors of finance have been heavily involved in the project. ADSW, ADES and others have equally been part of the conversation. But I think having them much more fully represented going forward is certainly a useful suggestion. Second element that seems to have come through in terms of how we embed relates to leadership. We've discussed the politicians, but more so for senior managers. I suppose the phrase that senior managers need to walk the walk on this, not just talk the talk, could summarise much of what seems to have been discussed. They have to show and demonstrate that benchmarking as an activity is a priority and accord it as such in terms of their own behaviours. They have to be part of the discussions within the benchmarking groups rather than just leaving it always to more junior managers across the piece. So they have to be actively engaged, not just someone who's advocating it themselves. They also have to get behind the changes that will emerge from this, and rather than see it as some kind of a threat to their own services, to see it as genuinely as part of an improvement process and be open to the suggestions that that process at drill down level will start to throw up for them. And then another suggestion that we get and capture some quick wins in all of this, to create a momentum, to show people that this is something that can actually work and deliver things for them. And again, I think that's a useful suggestion that helps them build some degree of commitment and shows people the positive aspects of benchmarking going forward. We also therefore need to have and retain political backing through COSLA and other bodies. And that core message coming only from politicians that we are as local government all in this together. And again, I think there'll be questions for other politicians in the fullness of time if we take this into the partnership arena. Lastly, in terms of embedding it, it has to become part of self-assessment, seems to be a key focus across the groups. It has to be part of the day job of service managers and improvement activities. Therefore, ensuring that this, as a framework, works well with a performance improvement framework such as the Public Service Improvement Framework, how good is our council and what have you, is an important part of the agenda. So again, some supports perhaps in place to make sure that the data and other activities that we're doing under benchmarking feed straight through into service planning, service improvement activities within councils. And then the last big issue we discussed overall was the role of Scottish Government, but I think in some of the groups that was also including the role of the Scottish Parliament itself. And I suppose the key theme coming through from the discussions that the facilitators had was that Government and Parliament need to get behind and support this development, and they've got an active role to play in supporting it. But it's more of a hands-off role. You know, the doing of the activity has to be very much local government's doing. If we are about a culture change within local government on this performance agenda, then avoiding prescription from the centre is important. But the centre still has got an important role to help play, support this, develop it, and give some supports along the way. And also about encouraging other sectors. I suppose that's a key issue for both government and the Parliament itself. For other public sector partners, police, fire, as well as CPPs themselves. If they're to be part of this going forward, then again, I think it's national politicians that should be leading that debate with their local government colleagues to take us down that route. Third issue that came up in, I think, a couple of the groups was about the volume of performance information and data that's collected across the piece. And we had an example, certainly from within my group, about left-hand drivers, where you get a kind of apocryphal story whereby a piece of data is requested and the number of left-handed drivers who have been convicted of various traffic crimes. Suddenly that creates the need to create a data set on that. That data set is maintained over time, and what we're very poor at doing in the public sector is getting rid of data sets, because once they're there, very hard to get them off the books. So there's an exercise perhaps about decluttering performance information, performance data over the piece, and focusing on the things that we absolutely need to know for good public performance, accountability and performance improvement reasons. And then lastly, a strong message, I think, from a couple of the groups around accountability and all of this. For Solace and for local government, accountability is to the local level. That should be the key driver here going forward in terms of the overall agenda, but certainly there's a role for other partners in the public sector and in national government to help support Solace and local government taking things forward. Now, that's probably a very poor summary of what was, I say, a very wide range of discussions. And again, if there are particular points that have not been fully recognised here, they will have been captured in the groups, and we'll certainly keep a note and a record of them. Kevin.
Thank you very much, Mark. I don't know, do any of the other facilitators want to add anything to that? We are a little bit ahead of time. No? In which case, we shall move on. Can I now welcome Martin Walker, Assistant Director of Best Value and Scrutiny Improvement Group of Audit Scotland. The Best Value and Scrutiny Improvement Group delivers best value audit reports on councils, fire and rescue services, and in conjunction with HMICS, police boards and forces. The group also produces overview reports on local government, police and fire statutory reports and thematic reports in the How Councils Work series, as well as coordinating the shared risk assessment process and statutory performance indicators. Martin joined Audit Scotland in 2004, having previously worked in councils for 14 years in various roles. Martin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. What I was proposing to cover in this wee slot is an auditor's perspective. I was reflecting back on what it is that might be of interest. I was also reflecting on the fact that I got the slot that was after lunch, and the slot that follows all the other speakers that we've already had this morning, and therefore trying not to be in a position where I ended up duplicating and repeating lots of stuff that was covered this morning. And maybe went out on a limb a little bit and thought what might be interested in is what is it that auditors are interested in. We'll see how that goes. It's an audit perspective. It's drawn from key messages that we found in audit reports. And then there's a few observations and reflections around what it is that, based on our experience of looking at audited bodies, might help with making improvements to benchmarking and performance measurement. So, audit work is all based around evidence. We like to come and arrive at our audit judgments based on firm evidence. And as a result, we really like performance measures. We really like benchmarking because that gives us a good base of information to make those judgments on. In the course of our business, we use performance information, we use benchmarking in a whole range of our work. So there's the annual audit process that people quite often might refer to as the annual financial audit. We use it in best value audit reports, we use it in our national performance audit reports. There is, of course, the statutory performance indicators, maligned in many parts, loved in others, but there are those, and obviously they've been a source of benchmarking for a fair few years now. We're keen to use lots of data and evidence as part of the community planning partnership audits that are currently under development just now. And we also use benchmarking data and other performance measures to inform the shared risk assessment process that we go through each year. Now, that's probably of interest, not least for the fact that that's one of the things that drives the audit work for the year. So, for example, when we're selecting where it is that we're going to do some best value audit work in the year to come, that very much is based on what the shared risk assessment actually tells us. The last point that I've got on this slide really kind of harks back to a lot of what was said this morning, that we recognise that performance is political. We recognise how performance information is used, and we also recognise, therefore, what can happen to our audit reports when they are put into the public domain. Certainly the group that I was involved in, the discussion, the breakout group just before lunch, there was a lot of discussion around this, around, well, if we publish this information, well, people will use it in a particular way. People will just go for the headlines. We're very aware of that, not least because that's what happens to our reports as well. I did share in that group that it has been known for us to write reports that are really quite positive about a range of organisations. But to be honest, they tend not to get much in the way of coverage. It tends to be the more critical ones that get the coverage. And I dare say some people be aware of some of those that have come out in recent years. So we do recognise that fact. In terms of the measures and the different types of performance measurement, I mean, this really, I suppose, is reinforcing rather than duplicating, I hope, some of the messages from this morning. So there's a range of different measures that can be used. And I think the key thing for us is they are best used in combination. I think just looking at individual measures, whether it be an input measure, like what something costs, a process measure, how quickly something is delivered, an output measure, what customer satisfaction is, they can only tell you so much unless you use them in some combination. And I think that's the key message for us. The other thing is around benchmarking against who and benchmarking against what. A lot of the discussion so far today has been around performance compared to others. And there's been also some discussion around performance over time. One of the things that we look for when we're doing our audit work is performance against an organisation's own targets. One of the things that came up this morning was, well, you know, maybe if performance has dipped in a particular area, is that always a bad thing? If we're doing some audit work and performance has dipped, but that's on the basis of an organisation deciding it will prioritise another area of work and that therefore it's acceptable or tolerable, if you like, that performance can dip in some areas, then we reflect that in the way that we consider making our judgments and then report on that. And if anything, actually, we might view that as a sign of a strong and mature organisation in that it can be comfortable enough with some areas where performance appears to be slipping, but that's on the basis of a decision. That's on the basis of a thought-through process. So it's not just as simplistic as performance going down is necessarily a bad thing. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago around using the measures in performance. One of the ones that we've probably reported on a lot in as far as it's an absence of something, in that we don't see a huge amount of cost information being used. Now, clearly the work that's being done just now is actually starting, if you like, to redress that balance a little bit on that. But we think a combination of a cost measure and an output measure can be really powerful in terms of identifying whether or not a service is actually delivering value for money. So, if an elected member, for example, was to get information in one report that says the educational attainment of the kids in this particular area is this level, that's a good thing, isn't it? Well, yeah. But if that same elected member also had a piece of information that says the spend on education in this area is twice as much as the next council, would they still arrive at that same opinion, that necessarily performance is quite as good as they first thought? So it's about using measures in combinations. When we're doing our work, we look at the measures, we look at performance, but there are two other things that we're really interested in. The first is around response and activity. So we have found instances where a council has got extremely good performance management arrangements, lots of measures, lots of benchmarks, lots of indicators, lots of reports that go to lots of committees with lots of information. One of the things that we're most interested in is what happens to that. What happens on the back of that performance information. If there's good arrangements, but they don't lead to any change and therefore aren't having an impact, we would question how valuable those are. So we're quite keen to have a see and identify where performance measures, benchmarking information, actually starting to make an impact in terms of activity. And then ultimately, the impact in terms of outcomes for the people in a particular area. Those are the things that we're most interested in. If you think back to the diagram that I had a couple of minutes ago with outcomes on the right-hand side and inputs on the left-hand side, typically we go first to the right-hand side of the spectrum and see what measures there are on outcomes, outputs. If we find a lack of information on that area, we start to work our way gradually towards the left of that diagram. And that's about finding the balance between what's measurable as against what's important. So, what are some of the issues that we found in audit reports? Well, I think that the key message is that benchmarking, performance management and all the rest of it has been variable, is what we found. We find it varies within councils, so you can have some service departments have got really good arrangements, other departments where the arrangements are less well developed. We find generally that there's not always good quality comparative information contained in performance reports. So sometimes you get time series data, sometimes you get other bits of comparative data, but you don't routinely see, we don't routinely see lots of good quality comparators to give the people who are scrutinising those reports, principally the elected members, the information that they need to be able to arrive at firm conclusions. And as I mentioned before, we don't always see a clear link between performance management information, benchmarking information and impact. Having said that, we also find examples where that is the case. You won't be able to read the detail of those, I'm sure, on the slide, but those are a couple of examples that came up and were published as part of a report that we put out in May, which was about using cost information. So we've got an example there from West Lothian, another one from Glasgow City Council, where cost information, benchmarking information was being used to actually drive improvement work. There's a lot of words on those slides, I'm not going to go through them, but just to say that there is some information there in that report if you're interested. So, in terms of then some messages that come from that, what is it that we tend to find, and therefore what I would suggest are useful things to consider when looking at measures, looking at benchmarking. The first thing is selecting measures that reflect the priorities of the council. I think particularly for elected members, getting measures that strike a chord, get some traction, make some sense, I think is a very important thing. So it's measuring priorities rather than measuring what's measurable. I've already said about getting a mix and a range of measures and using them in combination. And the third point there is one that certainly came up in the discussion group that I was in, is reminding ourselves that performance measures are actually to allow performance management. And just collecting the information, reporting the information is only a means to an end, not an end in itself. So it's important what actually happens with that. And that really is in terms of the amount of scrutiny that those performance reports and the benchmarks are subject to, and also the extent to which they support and identify where improvements needed. The last one is a bit of a personal hobby horse of mine, which is this quest for the perfect measure. I'm sure in every breakout group, and I'm sure at some point later on today, there will be the discussion about what the best measure is. I think that's just a waste of time. Measures need to be good, they need to be robust, they need to serve a purpose. But in my experience, both in councils and subsequently then in Audit Scotland, sometimes too much time and energy can be taken up looking for the perfect measure that is so defined, so acceptable, that everybody understands it and it's absolutely right. I don't think there is such a thing. So it's a question of remembering what the I in performance indicator stands for. It is an indicator. It's just a means to an end. A couple more observations then. Benchmarking, means to an end, not an end in itself. Mark mentioned this earlier on about benchmarking providing information which helps ask questions. I think can opener was the phrase that you used. So benchmarking can help identify issues, it can identify questions. So why is it that this council seems to be able to deliver twice as much of this service than our council? Why is it that their performance appears to be so much better than ours? The other thing to remember, though, is that benchmarking can also help with the answers. Not always data benchmarking. It may be in the form of process benchmarking or some other form of activity which is about making comparisons. But it provides the prompt to go and seek out the answers. The discussion earlier on included stuff around benchmarking family groups, for example. That's one solution. There's also the very, very simplistic solution, which is somebody looks at a set of measures, they identify what appears to be the best counsel on a particular service, and then a service manager just lifts the phone, speaks to a peer in another organisation. Sometimes it can be quite simple things that can really provide a useful way into these things, and it doesn't need a massive industry and a massive infrastructure supporting that. That said, some form of infrastructure is really quite important. I think the reality of the situation is that everybody's got a lot to do, everybody's busy, and where we find benchmarking has been most effective and where it's most well developed, it tends to be where there's some kind of infrastructure in place. So whether that be through the APSI benchmarking partnerships, whether it be the improvement service stuff, whether it be through individual councils, benchmarking groups that exist, some form of organisation to help underpin that, we think can be really quite helpful. The really important thing in that, though, is getting the balance right between having a big industry and a big infrastructure and something that's fit for purpose. This is a scenario, and I just wonder whether or not it's familiar to anybody, or even parts of this are familiar. So, for those that can't really see the screens, it reads, and I don't normally read out the slides, but I will in this instance. The first bullet says, people consider what data is available and what could be benchmarked. They then agonise over who to benchmark with in a quest for the perfect benchmarking partner. Then spend a lot of time gathering information, creating spreadsheets. Then collect the data, start gathering that, sharing that with benchmarking partners. Then they identify the discrepancies. Probably at that point have the apples and oranges discussion around why something isn't quite right because it's not quite the same after all. Then go away and try and revise the definitions and the data and do some data cleansing. Then come back and find out that there's still differences in place. Then report perhaps to a council explaining those differences or explaining the discrepancies, explaining why things aren't quite as they first might seem, and then find that all of that was a real faff, lots of time and energy and effort, lose the will to live, and probably don't do it again. Now, I don't know whether all of those strike a chord, but possibly some of those bullets, I see at least one or two smiles around the room, is something that strikes a chord with folks. For me, the message in this is that benchmarking information needs to be good enough to serve its purpose. I think that's really important. And when we pose the question in our breakout groups around what are the main barriers, I think it's sometimes just having a go at some of these, testing it, seeing if it works, seeing what you can get from it, rather than trying to design the perfect thing. This is a bit of the Audit Scotland marketing at the end, I apologise. There's a number of reports that we have produced that may be of interest around performance management, performance measures and related matters. The last one, there is an imminent publication about performance management that we're going to be taking to the Accounts Commission in October. What's interesting, you may find, is the first one up there, which is the kind of purple banded one. That's a publication called Measuring Up to the Best, which was an Accounts Commission publication from 1999. So a couple of people have said already today that there isn't anything new in this necessarily. Sometimes it gets rebadged, sometimes it has a different driver and so on. But the fundamentals of having good performance information and making comparisons isn't anything that's new. This one?
Thank you very much, Martin. We'll now move on to the discussion session. After having reflected upon the issues and challenges inherent in benchmarking this morning, this discussion session is an opportunity to consider benchmarking going forward. As you will be aware, the first strand of our inquiry was concerned with community planning and partnerships and outcomes, and it might be interesting to reflect on how benchmarking can be applied to CPPs to drive those outcomes. I'm now going to invite Alec Lingston to chair this session. Alec is a well-kent face in local government and the public sector in general in Scotland, former Chief Executive of West Lothian and now the Chair of NHS Forth Valley Health Board. Alec, over to you, sir.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, I think benchmarking is something we've all used in our careers. I know most or all local authorities use it at the present time. But I think this is a very ambitious project to build it up on a systematic way to help us deal with the challenges that we face going forward over the next decade or so. For a lot of good presentations today, a lot of words of advice. Put the first question to you, Mark. In view of what you've heard today, do you think your model is capable of living with what we've heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was heartening to hear from both Clive and Andrew this morning from their experience that many of the challenges we face are common challenges, but the broad approach that we've adopted seems to be very similar to particularly what Andrew was stressing. In fact, at the end of the presentations, Andrew turned and said to me, he said, God, you'd have thought we'd have set this up between us. We were so close together. So I think we probably are on the right lines. The key test, I think it came up from the discussion groups, is going to be around resources to support that. That will be key. Now, it can't simply be organisations like the Improvement Service doing this for people. We certainly got a critical role in terms of support, facilitation and so forth. Councils have to make this part of the day job for it to happen. So the real test, I think, will be within councils, potentially therefore across partnerships in the longer term, making this part of the day job. Our job is to help them in that and support them in achieving that. But they're the ones that ultimately have to drive it because it's their services, their performance, their improvements.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll put that question back that Mark posed about resources. First of all, I think Clive made the point this morning, collecting the data should be about 25% of the exercise. The analysis and acting on it should be the other 75%. We all know the work that's gone into collecting the information, so if that's only 25%, do you think councils are resourced to take this forward, both in terms of skills and capacity? Anybody like to give a view on that? Or how do we create the resources to take this forward? Silence. Yeah. Sounds like a council meeting where I make my other good suggestions. Well, what about quick wins? In terms of the feedback you made, Mark, you said it's important that we get quick wins. How do we get some quick wins from this? I'm going to have to start picking on people.
I mean, I think if I could maybe just come in on that one while people warm up to that. I think certainly one of the roles that we'll have as an organisation in all of this is to help capture good practice that's there. Now, it's not that we're going to have to go and discover everything from scratch. There's a lot of really useful practice in local government. It's a case of capturing it, sharing it, and getting it open to others. So I think for ourselves, I think that'll be one of our early priorities. Once we're through this data collection phase, if that's only 25%, God help me, by the end of it, I'll say that much. So I think for us, working with councils to know where the good practice lies, documenting that and getting it out quickly. Because it was interesting watching Andrew's hub from earlier on, that as well as that kind of a performance data that you can then analyse and look at and see where am I different from so-and-so. I think if you've got sat beside that some good practice examples, that will help. And I think that could be an early win here, that we can just help document that, share it, build the confidence that this thing is about genuine improvement and help people towards that.
Clive, from your point of view, how do we get some quick wins? Any words of wisdom to add to that?
I mean, when you were saying that, I was thinking about what quick wins I could remember happening. And frankly, one of the ways you get quick wins is to incentivise the behaviours you want. So, for example, one of the quick wins I remember in England is when I think it must have been the Brown government. I think wanted to speed up planning applications, and so the way they were dealt with. So they put a time limit. I think it was 8 weeks. They then incentivised councils against that. So that was a very specific one of these little sort of linking benchmarking to a sort of a theory of improvement. In that sense, they incentivised councils to behave in a certain way against a declared benchmark. Now, you might say that's pretty crude, and at one level it is, but quick wins in a sense are about something that mattered to enough people, something that was clear, simple, straightforward, and then could be incentivised. Now, then there was an issue about what happened when the incentive grants dropped off. But that's certainly one way you can do it. The other relatively quick wins I saw were some very heavy-handed but nonetheless quite effective interventions around children's and adult services using the joint review methodology that was used in 98 to about 2003 or so in England and in Wales. And that was around a topic that was very important to a lot of people, not just obviously the users and the children and the adults, but also to communities and to the media. Was a very strong intervention. People were named and shamed in very significant ways. So there are two very contrasting examples. One where you motivate, incentivize behaviour, another where basically you punish behaviour, and operating at very different levels. You know, the whole of social services, adult and children's services, as against a very specific example in the planning field. So there are ways. I think, though, the idea of a pure benchmark creating a quick win is unlikely. I think you've got to attach it to some other mechanism. Might be political exhortation. I think someone gave an example this morning. I think it was Andrew talking about the disability grants. Might be political exhortation. You've got to link it to some other mechanism so that benchmark becomes real for administrators, politicians and policymakers.
It's also the point that Martin made, that in selecting areas to prioritise, it should be something that's of interest to your own council. So that would take you away from sort of national incentives. And it maybe that's the way to get the politicians involved, is pick something that you know is a problem within your own council and prioritise that. What about yourself? And sorry, Martin, you want to add?
Yeah, you were just expanding Mark's point around good practice, best practice. So if one of the objectives of benchmarking is to identify who seems to be best in class, who seems to be performing well, I think one of the things that we need to consider is the language that we use around that. And I can say that on the basis of being an auditor, and we toil sometimes around producing these best practice examples, because we find ourselves beating ourselves up about the prospect about, well, is it really the best? What if it's not the best? What will people think of us if we say this is the best and it's not? And so we seem to sometimes set a threshold that's way too high to be actually useful. And now the way that we think about it when we're thinking about what exhibits we might use in reports, and there was a couple up there on the screen before, is essentially an idea of examples where it works for them. Rather than calling it best practice, or even sometimes good practice, the threshold that I think we need to consider that might be helpful is, well, this works for them. Let's publicise that. That may then be something that people are interested in. It may cause people to lift the phone, go visit, go see how another council is actually delivering a service. But I think that, like I say, there's something in the language about best practice can put people off offering it up as an example of best practice. It puts auditors off from identifying it and publicising it as such. So if we were just to recalibrate that a little bit and consider, well, this is effective in its own time, in its own place, this is effective, there might be something that we can learn from that. I think that might be quite helpful around this whole idea of best practice and good practice.
Thanks for that. Andrew, any experiences from Wales that you could offer?
I'm sure that there probably is already benchmarking going on that's making a difference, and that there are case studies there that could be picked up now and used to promote. My question is, what will quick wins will say that we've made some improvement in certain areas? What do you want to do? Do you really want to move the culture forward overall, in which case I'd look at a different quick win personally. And I'm not sure I totally agree with, one of the things that I've seen today is that there are all these frameworks. And you're asking local government to pitch into all these frameworks. And one of the lessons that we've learned as well is trying to at least bring them together. Because you've got you've talked about, you've got people collecting data for one and almost a similar data for another one. The quick win for me would be to get the owners of all these frameworks in the room and talk about how you consolidate them. That doesn't necessarily mean you do away with them while saying they're all right, but that you actually get a framework that if I'm a service manager delivering children's services, I understand where the measures of my service performance are being used and what they're being used for. And some of the arguments over resources go away then as well, and some of them about these make sense because I need them to manage my service and I understand how audit use them, I understand how they fit into that framework and that one. But that you consolidate, that would be something I think that if I was in local government in a performance area or managing a service, I'd like to think that you understood how they all fitted together and how they were all being used, and that you were working together to minimise the impact on me as someone who provides those indicators.
So anybody got a view on that? That is obviously at the heart of this.
Thank you. I'd like to agree with what Andrew has said. I find our landscape in Scotland extremely cluttered in terms of the outcome indicators that local authorities are expected to gather and report. And I suppose I have a question for Mark, which is around about the benchmarking indicators set. And the question is this: how useful do you think it is to have a set of SPIs that are reported in September and then have a set of benchmarking indicators, some of which are the same as the SPIs, that is gathered and reported in December? And is there no hope that we might bring these together into one national set of indicators that are reported to one organisation and reported but could be used for a variety of purposes? And sorry, David's just reminded me.
We'll keep the questions coming, don't we? Sorry.
Name and organisation.
Yes, Mona McCulloch, South Ayrshire Council.
I absolutely agree with you. We should collect the data once, use it for multiple purposes, and actually synchronise reporting timelines. I mean, this year we have been somewhat unlucky in the sense that in the middle of this project we then had a local government election, which meant we had to wait and get the assent of the new authorities about what we were doing, so that's kind of delayed us. We've also got an agreement now with the Accounts Commission that we will do a 2-year consolidated run of data, and to facilitate that they've simply said don't bother with the public performance reporting in September, hold it off till the end of this year. So that's put us out of sync with the SPIs and so forth, but we will reclaim that next year, and the idea is to get towards a consolidated reporting framework. You're absolutely right, that's where we need to be. So we use the data for multiple exercises, but cut down the number of reporting arrangements round about that.
$1 million question, but what is the difficulty about what Andrew has just described about there are so many indicators and there's so many different schemes that people are vying for that kind of same information? What is the difficulty about getting all those people into the one room and coming up with national set of indicators?
Whether it's a single national set of indicators, I'm not so sure. I mean, if you take what Solace have been doing, they're evolving that from within local government. So if this is part of the culture shift that we were talking about this morning, I think that's important. Do it for yourself because they're your services, etc. What we would therefore need to do is then get Audit Scotland, the various inspection bodies in the room again and say, are you prepared to say some of this replaces some of yours? That's a discussion that has to take place. And again, I think if we're talking about a role for Parliament and for government, I think helping support that type of discussion is important.
Back in again.
No, sure.
Chair, thanks, Alec. But it just seems so cumbersome that people are unable to move forward because they've got so many sets of indicators that they're reporting to right here, right now. So they'll not be able to think about moving on to what's there until you can free up that process.
Absolutely agree.
So that will not be able to go forward until that process is freed up.
It's certainly at times like swimming through treacle, yeah. And I think if you talk to many service managers, and again, they'll tell you, it's not that we lack data, we've got too bloody much of it. And again, we create a whole series of data sets, maintain them for no real purpose. Why? Take some of them away and focus on what truly matters to help drive performance and improvement, and I absolutely agree with them. So there are a lot of national agencies that have to be part of that discussion, and they have to be confident enough to relinquish some of their controls to create the space for this to grow and become the performance framework for Scottish local government.
Sorry, and again, Andrew, could you maybe help us on this about how you manage to kind of eradicate all that treacle and kind of water that down, and so to speak, to enable us to move forward. Because I don't think until then that we are going to be able to move forward. People's heads will not be able to move forward in their thinking until they can see the woods for the trees.
It was easy for me to sit here and say that's what you should do as your quick win. And I'm not going to pretend it is easy, because the inspectorate bodies have all got, for example, their respective roles, and they've got to be very... But you can do it. I mean, we do, we do have to bring, we bring our education inspectorate in when we're looking at what is it we need to be collecting from local authorities. We bring in the Wales Audit Office in. You can get people into a room. You probably want to compartmentalise it in terms of those who are collecting in different service areas, because you've got your social services inspectorates, you've got your education inspectorates, but it can be done, and it is about actually. You've first of all got to get national agreement on that you're going to have a framework, and that framework needs to meet the needs of all the respective members. So I talked about the fact that in local government, it's not prescribed to us what's in our data sets, but it tells us that we have to have comparable information, and then we have to take account of the needs of the regulators when we put that set together. So therefore, we can't have a discussion about what children's indicators are going to be without bringing the inspectorate body into the room. But that is a bit of give and take on both ways. But if you see that as a way of getting the improvement, and you say it's the benefit of a single set that you're getting of data for children's services, then people will go in with that mindset. I mean, language is important as well, because you can get an inspector to say, well, if I don't actually get what I want out of this, then I can actually collect it outside of the framework, because that's what my legal status is. But if they come in with the right mindset, it works. The only advice is to have the impetus from above to make it work, and then it is about getting people in a room and having the dialogue. And it won't always be easy dialogue, but it's about having that dialogue.
I think it's important what Andrew said there about willingness on both sides. And certainly in terms of the work that we've been doing with Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission, they've came a huge way with us, I think, over the last 12, 18 months. I don't think we've seen quite the same progress with some of the other inspection agencies. And I think they need to be willing partners in that process to agree that this is a key development and get in and work with us and Solace and others to support its development. And we can build some of the performance information that they need for inspection purpose into the framework, but they need to discuss that with us. And I think it would be useful to have all the inspection bodies having that kind of a conversation that Andrew's just outlined.
Seen a few faces light up when we were discussing this. Who's the best place to take this forward? Martin, is it Audit Scotland, or is it Improvement Service, or is it COSLA? If it is an action point that's going to come out of this, who's going to take ownership of that?
I think the discussion involving all those parties. I do know, certainly from the point of view of the Accounts Commission, who it is technically that sets the SPIs, they've kind of indicated their position is that if there are other performance measures like the ones that Mark was talking about earlier on that provide a better set of indicators, then the Commission, one of their options is to completely do away with SPIs altogether. They could say, yep, those are fantastic, we don't need to do it anymore. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is we don't like those indicators at all, here's a whole new bunch. Where they are at the moment, I think they're very much of the mind that provided they can gain assurance from a robust set of measures about performance in councils, they're much more inclined to pare stuff right back compared to the 60-odd that we have at the moment. So that's the direction of travel at the moment.
Yeah, well, that's a big price here.
I think Martin actually answered my question. I was quite surprised when Martin made a comment, there's a them and us, and, with regards to, the way that we're wanting to go forward. But surely that's a sort of dialogue that should, take prior to, the benchmark. I mean, if Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission have any expectation of how we should deliver services, surely, for benchmarking purposes, it must be that the benchmarking that we're about to, hopefully we come to a conclusion on meets the aspirations and ambitions of the accounts commissions to get a qualified reports in all times. So I'm a wee bit sort of surprised that we're still talking, using the language of them and us when collectively, we want to deliver the best we can for the money that we have available.
I think to be absolutely fair with the Commission, there's been a lot of dialogue over the last 18 months or so, and that has been very much a positive dialogue with them. And they gave us clear indications at the outset. In order to get their endorsement of this, it would have to meet the following criteria. One, that it would be genuinely comparable across councils, and two, it would have to be publicly accountable, and the public would need to be able to make sense of it. So we've been working with that all along with the Commission and giving them the assurance over the last few months about how we're now developing that to get their backing. That kind of discussion has to take place with the other inspection bodies so that they know what we're doing, they're comfortable with it, and they can then back off and assure on the assurance that we're picking up what needs to be picked up through this framework for them going forward. So you end up not having to duplicate, not having to gather the same information, but present it slightly different ways going forward.
Was it an agreed criteria then that you're going forward with, or was it the criteria that had to be applied by, which has been laid down by the Accounts Commission?
In our early discussions with the Commission, they just said to us, if you do this, we would like to see it happen. If this becomes an alternative to the SPIs, great. But the absolute minimum it will have to achieve for us is genuine comparability across councils and accountability and transparency. If it doesn't deliver that, then it doesn't matter how good it is, it won't work for us. And that's what we've been working to achieve with them, I say, over the last 18 months or so.
Martin?
Yeah, just on the SPIs, it's one of those things where the Accounts Commission, Audit Scotland, we don't claim that they are a perfect set of measures. They are imperfect, they are flawed, we know that, we accept that. So the Commission's view was very much, well, if there are a better suite of indicators that effectively can provide much better performance information, better comparative, and also be, help with public accountability, then that's absolutely fine. They've got no problem with that principle whatsoever.
Okay, well, that's quite a big gesture from the Accounts Commission, so well done. Kevin?
Thanks, Alec. I think one of the key things in all of this is that there has to be some agreement from all of the councils first before you can start talking to all of the other bodies. Has COSLA actually agreed the suite of benchmarking indicators that you have? And beyond that, there was certainly discussion at our group, I don't know about the others, will they be flexible? So maybe to take into account the views of the Accounts Commission and others if it comes to a wee bit of fine-tuning so that everybody's happy with them.
We certainly briefed COSLA prior to the election, and obviously we've had a change in administration since then. And the previous COSLA had endorsed the approach and told us to keep going with it. They fully signed up to what we were collectively trying to achieve. We've got an agreement that will now go back to the new COSLA to brief them and get them to in effect and endorse what we're doing. So I've had no feedback whatsoever to suggest that there'll be anything but a positive response, but it's just now a case of getting that scheduled with the new administration at COSLA and getting into leaders, talking them through everything and getting their formal assent.
The flexibility?
Yes. Again, getting it right for the Accounts Commission has been a key part of what we've been trying to achieve across the piece, because that's also useful to local government.
Adam, would you like to add to that?
Really just to supplement that with a bit of additional information, Adam Stewart from COSLA. There's a report going to leaders this week with the full suite of information. That's, I suppose, the final verification of that process which Marcus described. I think from our perspective, really the challenge is about our level of ambition around about this, and a number of people have talked about the sort of wider implications for community planning partnerships, the wider approach to public sector reform, and I think that's inevitably where we want to see this ending up. We know that that sort of step change in public sector reform, which is vital and is going to be required, can't happen at a very low level of management information, and so really it's about scaling up that benchmarking approach from where it is at the moment to where it might be in the future is probably the biggest benefit that we would see.
I'm hearing you correctly, Adam, what you're saying is COSLA are looking for a even bigger ambition than we've got at the present time.
I think that's right. I think it's about the journey of improvement, recognising that this is very valuable, but it in some ways sets the scene for what might be achieved in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we'll share that as a goal for that. Trying to get this phase established and moving it on to community planning indicators, where I think there will be huge benefits in that. Everybody agree with that? Does anybody disagree with that? I'll take it no hands going up as you're all agreed. So it's unanimous. Yeah. Okay, what do we require from the government to move this forward? We've already mentioned about a data framework, and I think that is one thing would involve the government in, because a lot of the information comes to them. What else are we looking from the government? Nothing. Wow, geez, they're getting off late.
I'm sure the government will be happy with that.
Yeah. Right.
I'm bound to say I think the government's got a much bigger role in this than that. It seems to me that it would be lovely to imagine that all these bodies will come together with their different statutory purposes and their different organisational histories and their different personalities and agree on, common frameworks and so on. And if you've got the time, could be this Parliament, could be the next. Those things take a hell of a long time. You need some kind of, call it a meta framework. Andrew actually mentioned that Wales does in effect have one in terms of the requirements that are placed on local authorities that they must publish comparative service data, although it doesn't actually specify exactly what that data is. But there's a statutory framework there into which people can act, and that sets up some creative tension between what's being required and requested at nationally, at national level, but nationally on behalf of communities and local authorities, and what those bodies have to do. You have to get that tension right. But in my view, you need some degree of tension, because you do need to pull people along. It's not just about, an agreement of the willing, because you don't always get complete consensus, and you sometimes need to draw people through a little bit and just pull them a little. So I'd say it's for the government, I would say, to do two things: to set some kind of, and it might be a very broad framework of policy. It might be something with a legislative component in the way that Andrew referred to in Wales. It certainly ought to include some view about how improvement takes place in public services and what the approach to public service reform is. That's the critical context, and I took our colleague from COSLA to be saying something very consistent with that, and if so, I completely agree with him.
Andrew?
I just have to echo that. I mean, it's important. There could be at day one that you have lots of enthusiasm, but what happens when everything in the garden isn't quite so rosy, and you come across times where performance will dip in authorities, and where people can't opt out when things aren't going so well either. I mean, quite often I imagine once a year we at least go back to our letter which tells us what we've got to do, and just remind ourselves, or maybe remind authorities, look, we have to, as a group of authorities, publish this data. We have to do this. We have to benchmark. We have to make sure that the regulators are on board. It's just that it's that framework which I just think gives us the sufficient to ensure that we move forward, but we don't feel constrained. And I do think that local government, for the first time probably in Wales, does feel it owns that set of data that it publishes as public accountability measures. It owns them, so they're not prescribed, but it knows it's got to do it, and it knows it's got to do it in a robust way such that it meets the needs of regulator colleagues as well. So I would echo that there's definitely a role for the government.
Mark, statutory policy framework, is that on the agenda?
I think you'd have to ask colleagues in government about that one. But certainly if you ask me... No, I'm not in a position. We don't make policy as an organisation, thankfully. We just help implement policies others create. But I think if you look at Scottish local government, we already have the framework. It's best value. It sets down the clear criteria that we should meet as public bodies to achieve service improvement and accountability. What we're now discussing is what's the best mechanism to achieve some of that. And what I would be looking for is support from colleagues in other bodies as part of that conversation. The framework's there, and that framework potentially could be expanded across community planning partnerships through the community planning review that's taking place at the current moment in time as well. So we've got the nuts and bolts of it. Now we're talking about the detail that sits beneath. That's all. Yeah. I don't think we need a new policy framework because we have a very strong policy framework through best value in local government.
Do you agree with that, Clive?
It's a while since I looked at your best value framework in great detail. I'm sure Mark's right. Whether, for example, the other bodies, whether the other inspection bodies, what their direct connectivity into that best value framework is, and whether that, as it were, overrides or informs their statutory purpose. You know, it may be you need to. You certainly wouldn't want to junk that and start again, but it may be you'd want to look at whether that framework is quite fit for the kind of purpose. I mean, it's what, 10 years old now. You might want to look at it and see whether it's actually fit for the purposes that you want it for now.
I mean, I think back to the point you made about creative tensions within the system. That's how I would more see the role of the inspection and audit bodies. You know, Martin coming along and asking the kinds of questions that he set up on the screen there is a very useful driver within the system. It helps keep people focused. It helps keep people sharp to why you're doing this, what's the ultimate purpose of it, and so forth. And again, if that was extended across all audit and inspection bodies, and they behaved in a sense, a more corporate fashion, the same way we're seeking to get councils to behave in a more corporate fashion around this, I think that would be something that could be done to help strengthen the system overall.
Ask for a show of hands. Who thinks we need a new statutory policy framework, or who thinks we could do it within the best value framework? So ask for a show of hands. First of all, who thinks we should do it by a statutory policy framework? Who thinks we need new legislation to sustain this? Nobody. Who thinks we can do it within the best value framework? Yeah. And a few don't know. Okay, good. Thanks for that. You're voting twice, Bill.
Thanks, Alec. Bill Howard here today in the capacity as an advisor to the Local Government Committee on the budget, but also ex-civil servant and ex-council chief executive. And I have to come in here, Alec, you know I do. I really do counsel caution about rushing into legislation on a matter like this. Underlying everything that we've heard in the last 20 minutes or so is the fact that this is the effort by the local government family to recognise that improvement is necessary, that benchmarking is a very important way of doing that, and to take unto itself the responsibility of finding meaningful indicators through which that can be done. And what you've just teased out is that there's a lengthy process engaged in at the moment between the Solace and the Improvement Service and SIPFA and COSLA, they're all there, with the regulators, various kinds, Audit Scotland, the inspectorates and so on, trying to bring that process to something that everybody can feel comfortable with. Now, as a civil servant, I have to say I was always cautious about using legislation. I do not like the use of duties, especially when you've got such an overreaching duty as the best value one. Because once you start to specify duties, then you put yourself into the hands of people who are going to interpret them in very specific ways, and that changes behaviours. And you have to think about that very, very carefully as a legislator, and I'm conscious that we have legislators in the chamber. So I counsel caution on that one for a start. I especially counsel caution where you have an exercise in train which is clearly voluntary. As far as I can see, everybody in the room is reasonably content with the way it's going. And that therefore what we should be doing is, and the original question, Alec, was, is there a role for government? Yes, there is. It's to facilitate, it's to make sure that the framework is there. Is there a role for the Scottish Parliament? Yes, it's to encourage, it's to make sure that we don't over-legislate, that we don't over-prescribe, that we'll leave that, to pick up Kevin's point, we'll leave some flexibility in this system because the world keeps changing and the demands are going to keep changing. So I very strongly counsel caution against moving quickly to anything to do with statute, unless we get to Clive's point, which is that we find that with experience, the legislative framework is no longer fit for purpose. And that's quite a hard test to make and quite a hard one to call. Can I just throw one other point in, Alec, from earlier, if you don't mind? We had a bit of a discussion around early wins. And some of this, I think, also reflects the underlying point here. This has been a journey. We're on a journey here that started quite a few years ago, as you're more than aware, Chair. And there's a very big milestone coming up. That is when this goes public. Now, the one thing I thought that in Mark's excellent summation of all the comments that came back, the one thing I thought he was a bit light on was what's going to happen at publication. And in your summation of it, Mark, you kind of gave the impression doesn't really matter what we do. The media are going to have their field day. They'll do their league tables, and we've just got to roll with that. I would strongly advocate that we have a communication strategy around this that deals not just with the day that it gets published, but before it starts trailing it, as you're doing here, and deals after it, because although you might get headlines for a day or two into the Sundays or whenever you launch it, there's going to be a follow-on into the journals, into all the other longer-term media. And it's not just about the broadcast media or the written media. So I think, in addition to all the excellent work that you've outlined today about taking forward the process, I think you desperately need to have a very good and clear communication strategy that engages all the stakeholders.
Is that something that you will be picking up on?
It's something we're already working on, but I take Bill's point, absolutely.
Yeah, good. Margaret?
Just as one of the legislators in the chamber who's an aversion to legislation, I think we've passed far too much legislation. Legislation in itself achieves nothing. I think if we've learned anything today, then we have to take the councils with us. They've got to see the necessity to do that and also the advantage in doing that. So for me, I think the local government, the national government, the central government, Scottish government's role will be to monitor, to look at the regulators, to perhaps bring them together where there are maybe some difficulties in terms of how they're assessing various things, to almost have the carrot and the stick where someone is genuinely struggling in resource terms, to be sympathetic to that, and where someone isn't cooperating, to be quite hard on them. And I think that would be the role of the government and Parliament to an extent as well.
Well, I think there's a clear message that we don't want legislation unless it's absolutely necessary. So I think we all know where we stand. We need to make it work. I could also say, received another tweet from Elaine Gill, owner director of AG Perspectives. She says, quick wins will sometimes require a degree of risk or leap of faith. So I think that's one for noting. Thanks very much to Elaine for that. Any other points anybody wants to actually raise? Do I take it from both the discussions before lunch and lack of comments just now that everybody is content with the direction of travel? We're all going to get our jackets off and make it work. I'm going to bring in a new culture in Scotland. Don't see any nodding heads, but I see a few smiling faces. Okay, well, unless there are any other points, we'll just wind up the session.
Thank you, Alec. Now, we could drag this out to 4 o'clock as in the timetable, but I think I'll give my closing remarks now and you'll be able to get tea and coffee outside and chat informally afterwards. Can I thank all those who've attended and participated in today's seminar? I'd particularly like to thank the speakers, Dr. Clive Grace, Andrew Stevens, Mark McAteer and Martin Walker. I'd also like to thank Sarah Gadsden, Barry McCulloch and Dot McLaughlin for facilitating the breakout groups, and of course to Alec for chairing this afternoon session. Could I also thank Eileen Gill for her tweets, because quite honestly, I didn't think anybody would be watching this, and I'm glad that you are, Eileen, and I'm glad that you've taken the effort to let the committee know your views through Twitter. I hope that you found this to be a useful and productive session. I've certainly found it very useful, and I think my colleagues would say likewise. I think as a committee we've learned a lot today, and we've got a number of challenges, and we know that they're not all going to be easy to overcome, but you can be assured that we will be continuing on with this process and looking at all of the issues very rigorously indeed. Going forward with the inquiry, we've already agreed that we will hear from COSLA and invite further evidence from Solace and the Improvement Service. The committee will reflect upon what it has heard today and on that basis determine the direction of the inquiry and what further evidence it needs to inform its work. What the committee has heard today also enables the committee to reflect on how the committee itself can add value. Today is the start of the committee's work in the inquiry, and we would very much welcome further contribution from you to inform the inquiry as the committee goes forward. Maybe some more of you can tweet in, or written submissions are always welcome, of course. Could you please note that an official report of today's seminar will be produced. Once that has been produced, we will send a link out to you. Once again, thank you all very much for coming here today and adding value to our inquiry. Thank you. Did go off and members bravely continued as the Speaker announced again and again to stay where we were. So I do hope that that doesn't happen today. Can I welcome you to this Local Government and Regeneration Committee seminar on benchmarking and performance measurement. I'm Kevin Stewart. I'm the Deputy Convener of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Following last week's government reshuffle, the committee is without a convener at the moment, as Joe Fitzpatrick has been made Minister for Parliamentary Business. However, I do have some colleagues with me today, Margaret Mitchell, Anne McTaggart and John Pentland, and I'm quite sure that they will be very interested to hear what you have got to say today. As you will be aware, the committee is undertaking a three-strand inquiry into public service reform in Scotland. In June, it concluded Strand 1, which focused on community planning, partnerships and outcomes. Today marks the beginning of the committee's work on Strand 2. Strand 2 is concerned with benchmarking and performance measurement in local government in Scotland. The purpose of the inquiry is to consider how benchmarking can affect an improvement in the delivery of public services. Today will be a chance to be informed about the purpose and effectiveness of benchmarking, but more importantly, the committee wants to hear your thoughts and views on benchmarking, and the question and answer session and breakout groups this morning, as well as the discussion session this afternoon, provides you with an opportunity to inform the event and the development of the committee's work going forward. This event is very much the starting point of Strand 2, and the outcomes from this event will inform the direction the committee takes as it moves forward with the inquiry. As you may know, Solace and the Improvement Service have been developing an approach to benchmarking in local government. This seminar will provide you with details of the work undertaken to date by Solace and IS, and offers an opportunity to question the authors of the approach. For your information, we have included within your delegate pack a copy of the committee's work programme. As you will note, the committee will be focusing on public services reform and regeneration over the coming months. The committee is keen to engage with as many stakeholders as possible going forward and wants to hear from you in relation to these matters. Before I invite Dr. Clive Grace to speak, can I remind delegates of the questions set out in the delegate pack, which will inform the breakout groups, and invite delegates to keep these in mind when listening to the speakers. I'm now pleased to welcome Dr. Grace. Clive is a former Chief Executive of Turfin County Borough Council in Wales and former Director General of the Audit Commission in Wales. He is currently advising the Tunisian government in the design of a public service benchmarking system to support the move to federal governance and the challenge of regional economic development and poverty reduction. He is also dealing with the Nepal government on civil service reform. He is an Honorary Research Fellow at Cardiff Business School and an Honorary Life Member of both the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy and also of Solace. Dr. Grace, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be with you. It's a privilege to be asked to contribute to your work, and whilst I am here to contribute, I very much expect to be learning a lot as well. Sandra Nutley and I are part of a project which is looking at benchmarking of public services internationally. And at a conference we had in London earlier this year, Mark McAteer gave a presentation on what was happening in Scotland, and there was huge interest in the approach that Scotland was taking in terms of the collaborative approach and the way it's engaging stakeholders. So it's very good to be here. This is the list of topics I'm planning to go through. There's quite a lot of slides here, and I'm not planning to speak through them all. The presentation's available from Ewan and his colleagues if you would like to have it, and Sandra and I will be happy to come back with any questions or queries you have about the presentation itself. So these are the issues we're going to cover: what it is and why it matters, the varieties and scope of benchmarking, the purposes for which it's done, the issues it raises, the question of theories of change and improvement which benchmarking is embedded in, the tricky question, this was the slide that took me longer to draft than the rest of the presentation, politics, politicians and benchmarking. The question of whether benchmarking is an arrow or a silver bullet, and then the importance of a systematic approach. Benchmarking has its origins in private sector comparisons. For current purposes, it's best thought of not in any tight definitional terms, but simply as the comparison of services against an external standard. It matters enormously in the public service in the UK for very particular reasons. Partly the sheer cost and scale of the services which UK local government delivers. This is a real outlier and terribly unique in international terms. So that's one of the reasons. It's just what local government does is just so important and is relatively so costly. I don't mean in unit cost terms, but overall scale. Secondly, because of what people generally refer to as vertical fiscal imbalance, i.e. that local government delivers most of the services, but generally speaking using money that's provided centrally. There is obviously local tax collection, but it's the minority of funds. Thirdly, because there is, notwithstanding the emphasis that people give to local matters, there is in fact a public aversion to the postcode lottery, and people want to compare, want to know how their area is doing against others and over time, not content with as it were, simply holding their own public services locally to account. And because in effect what one has in the UK is an inversion of that old thing about no taxation without representation. In a curious way, in UK local government, there's local representation and service delivery without a great deal of local taxation, relatively. If you speak to people in the US, in US local government circles about these kinds of things, they look at you a bit surprised. From their point of view, they collect their taxes locally, they spend their money on the services that they're asked to provide them, to provide. they're held to account at the ballot box. It's a very straightforward relationship where electoral and fiscal responsibilities align. The lack of alignment in the UK is one of the principal reasons why benchmarking is so critical. Here's a simple taxonomy of benchmarking. It just underlines how ubiquitous it is. You can benchmark services, you can benchmark corporate capacity, inputs, outputs, outcomes, processes. There are pros and cons of doing all this, but the range of choice is enormous. In terms of how benchmarks are set and what you set them for, there are some correspondences. So, for example, if you're particularly interested in economy, then financial benchmarks are most likely to be what will take your fancy. If it's around efficiency, then productivity benchmarks. If it's excellence, then excellence is a very difficult thing to benchmark, but it has been benchmarked systematically in the UK before. And generally speaking, when it's done, it's usually done around innovation kinds of benchmarks. And in terms of who does it, there's an equally wide range. One can give it to an external agency, as was done generally in the UK, in England and Wales at any rate, as far as the Audit Commission was concerned. You can have sector-led regulation, but with some, as it were, overall central supervision, or you can have self-regulation. And there is no, to my mind anyway, there is no magic about either of those. People generally have a preference for self-regulation. It feels voluntaristic, it feels right and good and proper, and if you can make it work, no doubt it is a very good way to go. But if it means your data sets have no authority, if your definitions aren't stable, if you can't actually properly compare, then a voluntary approach may not be the right way to go. Benchmarking is ubiquitous. This is a list of some of the varieties that one sees around England and Wales in particular. And I also spent some time thinking about whether the particular instruments that have been applied in Scotland, BVA, outcome agreements, whether they represent benchmarks. My provisional conclusion is that they don't. They draw on a lot of benchmarks, but some of the key features that distinguish the Scottish system at the moment, as I understand it, I wouldn't think of as a benchmark approach per se, though, as I say, I think they're built on a lot of benchmark data, but this may be a matter for discussion as we go. I said there are a variety of purposes. Why it is that we develop these lists, which all start with the same letter, I'm not sure, but this one seemed to work reasonably well. Your purposes might be for purposes of economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and excellence. But also, in any system like this, there is both the potential and there are some drivers for gaming. So one may find that actually benchmarking is in part, or for some people, about evasion rather than those other very good purposes. It's perfectly possible. It's also, especially in England at the moment, a very strong focus on anything that relates to austerity and will help deliver the austerity agenda. But thinking through the purposes for which one is doing this is absolutely critical to the effectiveness of any system. Some of the issues I've alluded to already. The first is slightly technical but absolutely critical. Are the definitions that are used and the units for comparison which are chosen. And clearly this has enormous importance in terms of the resources which are applied to generating the data, validating it, making it consistent, but also doing this in a way where one will have definitions which persist over time. There is very little in the benchmarking world which is worthwhile doing in a snapshot. You can do snapshots, and they may be relevant for some things, but most of the time, what one's looking for is time series and consistency and a valid basis for comparison. And that means definitional matters are important. Having said that, if you go back to the high priests of benchmarking, who I guess were the people, my colleagues in the Audit Commission, who ran the statutory performance indicator sets, the guidance on what the indicators meant ran at one stage to over 300 pages. That was just the definition of what the indicators were, and one can see that when one gets to that point, there are real questions about just how accessible all this is and whether it's not become too complicated and cumbersome. I mentioned there that there is currently very little comparison of public services between England, Scotland and Wales. That relates partly to definitions and units, and it's partly related to the different approaches to public service reform which are happening. It remains, I think, a significant issue, not particularly because one wants to be able to compare countries and say one country is doing better than another, but because some of the natural comparators for some of the things happening in Wales and in Scotland are to be found in England rather than respectively in Wales and Scotland. And one of the most obvious is what's going on in cities and how you benchmark city performance. It's very difficult in Wales. If you want comparators for Cardiff, Newport, Swansea, if you want comparators for them, really you've got to start looking outside of Wales. And I think there is a general issue for all three governments of the UK, Scotland and Wales to address this question more directly. I mentioned some of the technical issues, but then the question of authoritative interpretation. Who's being given the responsibility and the right to interpret? It could, of course, be along with any technically authoritative person or body, the public themselves. And that's obviously very important in terms of transparency and accountability, but it does bring its own disciplines and issues. Just as important is then what's going to happen. Where's the action in response? If you have a system which highlights issues, possibilities, opportunities, as well as problems, you authoritatively interpret them, but you have no, as it were, channels to action, then potentially one undermines the value of the benchmarking system and potentially create a great deal of frustration in the system. And finally, the importance of this wider context of public service reform and the operating theory of improvement. I was really impressed that your own committee has taken the view of looking at this in that wider context, and I think that was absolutely right and essential. The question of what the theory of improvement is particularly important. We may come back to, but it's at the end of the day, it's what you think people have to do in order to make change happen. And there are lots of candidates for that. Is it about Audit Scotland exposing things? Is it about the chief executives through the Solace branch resolving to do things better? Is it about the public shining a light on poor performance and responding through the ballot box? It's probably all of those, but what's the mixture? What are you going to support and most encourage when it comes to how you want things actually to improve in the light of the opportunities and the problems your benchmarking system identifies? I'm just going to run very quickly through a few of these slides. This was one of the in England and for a time in Wales before devolution. This was the Michael Barber theory of change and improvement, how you drive public services from awful to adequate. The way you go about that was to inject strong amounts of finance while setting national standards and assessing corporate capacity, developing a public balance scorecard, and using lots of external stimulus, naming and shaming a system which was typically called terror and targets. Even Michael Barber doesn't believe this is the right kind of system if you want to go from good to great. But this is a coherent, whether you agree with it or not, it represents a coherent approach. They knew what they wanted to do. They were willing to accept the description of their own system as being one of terror and targets because they figured they had to drive public services from awful to adequate. That's what they thought they were doing from 98 to 2004-05. So they had a coherent theory. They backed it with a benchmarking system to give themselves the data. They resourced it in very particular ways. They gave themselves intervention powers to be able to provide action in response. That was, as it were, a comprehensive approach. It's history now, but the fact that it was comprehensive and connected and thought through are the features of it that I want to draw attention to today. This was how the Blair and Brown government described the system as they saw it. Again, lots of variance on this, but this is actually one of the most, again, coherent, thought-through approaches, trying to think about the different forces which go to make better public services and how it all fits together. Best value PIs I've referred to. This was a sort of high watermark probably. CPA, single and upper tier, which I imagine you're familiar with by reputation, though it's not obviously the path that Scotland took. A comprehensive area assessment was an extension of that, which took it, I think, closer to some of the approaches that have been more attractive to the Scottish Government and Scottish Public Services, but still a bit different. Peer review, which I know has been more popular in Scotland and remains a very important methodology, has very distinct limits, though, in my view. If you want to analyse these kinds of approaches more formally, this is the best schema that Sandra and I and colleagues have seen and applied. It comes from the work of Christopher Hood, but this would give you an opportunity to, because these are actually risk regulatory regimes. That may seem like an odd thing to call them, but what's actually happening in this fundamentally is that you're looking at the risk of, in this case, not having better public services. You're thinking about how that's going to be regulated, and by regulated that may mean self-regulated. It doesn't have to be regulated by an external body. And it is a regime. It is a comprehensive approach. So that's one way of getting into formal comparisons if you wanted to get to that point at some stage. So I should pause here, given that I'm in the Scottish Parliament. So I genuinely do think that the relationship between politics, politicians and benchmarking is a marriage made in both heaven and hell. At the end of the day, it is fundamentally politicians who are accountable for public services. The administrators, the apparatchiki, people like Alex and I, in our old jobs, have a part to play, had a part to play, but actually, at the end of the day, it's politicians wanting better things for their community, better outcomes for their society, which drive these kinds of processes, and that's absolutely right. That is the critical political accountability which underpins all public services improvement. But there are huge problems, and they relate particularly to the time horizons of politicians, because it's very, very difficult as a politician to have a time horizon around matters which give rise to so much feeling around public services. It's very difficult to say don't worry, our benchmarking system is showing where the issues are. We've got a plan in 2 or 3 years' time. Don't worry, out there you will see change that's beneficial. It's much better, it's much more likely that there will be a different kind of response, and you're the experts in that, so I'm not going to describe what those are. So great benchmarking of public services, using it really well, to my mind, requires tremendous political self-discipline. And that's very difficult when politicians are subject to the kind of pressures which they are subject to in the modern world. In any event, and I think you're already, in a sense, ahead of this slide in terms of the approach you're taking, benchmarking is an arrow in the quiver of public services improvement. It's not the answer. It's always, in my view, best applied from what I call the improvement end of the telescope. Putting yourself in the position of what do I want to improve? How do I think that's going to happen? How do I assess where public services are and what will move them on? And do I then want to only measure the outcome in terms of what the eventual improvement is, or do I want to measure some of the intermediate processes? CPA, for example, measured a lot of the intermediate processes. Does this council have the corporate capacity to be able to deliver what's needed? BVA did that as well to a considerable extent, though it didn't have the same external benchmarking and judgmental qualities that CPA had. But whatever the sense of what you want to improve and why, that's what should guide the benchmarking system, rather than, for example, what's easiest to measure, what are people clamouring for today and yesterday. You've got to have that broader sense, because that's what will give you a sea anchor and a rudder when you're buffeted by the winds of public opinion. So it's applied from the improvement end of the telescope in the context of a thought-through policy of public service reform and improvement, and ideally, and this is, I think, very important, a fair degree of political consensus. If you can get agreement across political parties for the kind of benchmarking system you're going to have, that's very, very important to the administrators and local authorities who are trying to implement and deliver these, and to the public, and with the support of key stakeholders, and clearly that's an approach you're taking. And finally, it is important to be systematic, and I've emphasised that, but I would just say it's not about having one overarching, complete system. You need to work out and carefully design the benchmarking approach. It doesn't guarantee success. You can be almost sure that if you don't work it out, you can guarantee failure. It may not be failure this year or next year, but it will be failure within 3 to 4 years. And, the history of public services in the UK is littered with failed and altered systems of benchmarking. It's not one benchmarking system fits all. Use different services, different situations, call for different benchmarking solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grace. It will be interesting if you have a read of the final report whether you think the committee has tremendous political self-discipline or not. Thus far in this inquiry, there has been a fair amount of cross-party support, and I hope that will continue. Our next speaker is Mark McAteer of the Improvement Service. Mark was supposed to be joined by Ronnie Hines of Solace today, but unfortunately Ronnie is ill, so you're a solo act rather than a double act today. IS and Solace have been working on a collaborative basis to come up with a comparative benchmarking framework for Scottish local government in terms of cost, productivity and related outcomes. And today Mark is going to tell us what you've been up to thus far. Mark, please.
Thank you, Kevin. And again, can offer apologies from Ronnie for not being able to make it with us this morning. I'll chat you through briefly some of the background to the project for those of you who are not quite aware of some of the detail. And then I want to pick up an example of how we're using some of the data within the benchmarking framework itself. I think I agree with a lot of what Clive was saying, and again, maybe in the Q&A we can kind of come on and talk about some of the consistencies between us. So, in a sec, get this working. Oh, I'm just going to get myself a little. And again, I think he started by saying purpose is important. When Solus approached the improvement service roughly about 2 years ago to undertake the work on benchmarking, we agreed with them a clear statement of purpose for the exercise itself and what it was designed to achieve for Solus. Critical for them from the outset, and again reflects much of what Clive was saying, was this should drive improvement in terms of council service delivery at the end of the day. That was its paramount purpose. To do that, they wanted to have a genuine comparative framework for performance across all 32 councils, and it's important to state again, all 32 councils are part of the exercise. But given the times that we're in, there was a strong emphasis within that around the efficiency and the cost elements of council service delivery, but not losing sight of productivity, service quality and outcomes at the end of the day. But it was to get a greater understanding of all of those factors that the exercise was initiated. The brief we were giving initially was that this should be big ticket issues, i.e. the areas of major service expenditure, and that's what we've largely focused on, although in terms of development we will come on and look at a range of other areas going forward. We also agreed some principles from the outset with Solus, that this had to be genuinely a consensus process. All 32 councils, as I said, signed up to it. Initially, we had to keep all 32 councils as part of the project, otherwise it would start to lose some of its potential power. So some of the 2 years in between initiation and where we are now has largely been around discussion, negotiation, at a fair degree of length with all 32 councils to get consensus on each of the stages that we've gone through. We were also clear from the outset that the indicators that we would end up with were to be high-level indicators, can openers. They wouldn't explain everything about councils and their performance. What they would allow were chief executives to open up the can of their service and start to say, where do we vary on this service in comparison to other councils across Scotland? And then have a process to drill down into that to then explain why that variation existed. So the key point from the outset was to get to common understanding through data of where councils vary across service performance, and then go and explore why that was the case and what do we need to do to help improve services thereafter. Therefore, it had to be comparable across all 32 councils simultaneously, across those major areas of service performance. As I say, it's been roughly on the go for about 2 years. We set up initially with Solus a service classification across those big ticket service areas, children's services, corporate services, social work and so forth. And in each of the areas, when we then went to develop indicators, we started off by looking at, are there existing indicators that could be useful here, or do we have to develop something from scratch? And we used some criteria to help consistency in that process. So how relevant was it ultimately to the service? Was the data that we would pull upon going to be unambiguous and clear in terms of what it could tell us? How timely was the data? How accessible and consistent was it? How cost effective was it to collect the data itself? What we didn't want to do was to create a whole new industry around this. We wanted to get it as streamlined as possible. And also, how statistically robust was the information that we would be pulling upon at the end of the day in order to make these judgments? And it had to materially help councils improve. It's not an exercise in gathering data for the sake of gathering data. It's to get the data to the point where it can then help councils drive improvement in their performance going forward. In terms of the outputs from the exercise, at the moment we've got around 47 indicators where the data is robust, reliable, consistent, etc. And there are about 8 other areas that we've already identified that need a bit of work on them in order to improve that. So they've been tagged for development in the next iteration of the exercise. They include areas like economic development and planning. They're not big ticket in the sense that they're big spend areas, but they've got strategic importance to councils in terms of their activities, so we'll develop some indicators with colleagues there. And throughout all of this, we've had ongoing discussions with Audit Scotland, and again, in the last couple of months, they've identified a couple of additional areas that we'll incorporate into the framework going forward in its next iteration. So it's just to again reiterate, we've got in effect cost, output and customer satisfaction, getting close to something like a balanced scorecard, information now across all of those major service areas in Scotland. And it's been done on a collaborative basis with councils. They've fed into the development of each of these indicators and understanding the data that underpins them and so forth. And we're now at the stage where we've gathered that for the first year of the exercise. The baseline year that we've set is 2010-11, which is already considerable time away, but that's one of the challenges we face, and we may come on and talk about. The timeliness of data within public services themselves proves to be a challenge. But we've now got, as I say, all of those indicators gathered, and we've got 3 years previous data. One of the exercises we had to do with the data was to better account for support costs across council services. So we've taken the 10-11 exercise, worked with directors of finance to better understand where we apportion service support costs across the financial information of councils. Some support costs go directly to services themselves, education, social work, etc. Some are in a corporate pot. But across councils, the same services aren't necessarily located and accounted for in the same parts of the accountancy system. So we've had to clean up data in a sense, which has meant that that previous 3 years data that we have isn't 100% comparable to our base year, but it's still useful for interrogating the base year figure. So we've now got, as I say, the base year data cleaned up with directors of finance, and we've pulled that together to look at where the different councils appear against that data across the piece, and I'll show you an example in a minute or two. Core data source we've pulled upon is the local financial return. The LFR is the data that's council costs that go through an audit process. They were not designed for benchmarking purposes, but they're still very useful for benchmarking purposes. And what we've been doing over the last 6 or 7 months with directors of finance is strengthening some of the classifications around the data that underpins the LFR so that it is much more robust and comparable across all 32 councils. We've also drawn data from statutory performance indicators as they remain individually some very useful quality and performance indicators in their own right. And I say we've also got within there customer satisfaction data, which currently comes from the Scottish Household Survey. At council level, it's a flawed data source because the sample sizes as you get down to individual councils are pretty small. But at the moment, it's the best data we've got. So it's in there as a holding position until we can evolve better satisfaction data consistently across all 32 councils going forward. And I suppose, to be fair, overall, the weakest area has been round about support costs in terms of corporate services, hence the exercise over the last 6 or 7 months with directors of finance to improve the availability and quality of that data. We've agreed again with Solace that we'll develop some family groups in this. So you've got all 32 councils, but what we also want to do is group councils on a like-for-like basis so that they can get into much more of the detailed drill-down activity upon once you explain the variation, what's going on behind the scenes, behind the numbers. Again, to do that, we looked at a variety of methodologies. We looked at SIPFA's approach, Education Scotland, the Welsh Data Unit, we'll hear from Andrew. And again, most of them have operated a very similar methodology for how you pull together groupings of organisations. So we've adopted most of their methodological approaches. What you do essentially is you look at the social economic characteristics of the population that an organisation serves, and you use that to then construct the family groups. So we've got a draft set of groupings agreed with Solace. That will be signed off in the next few weeks with them going forward. Now, that's not to say that councils will only work within their family group in the Solace project. They will have access, obviously, to all 32 councils, and should they wish to explore with an authority with their family group some of the issues behind the numbers, they'll be perfectly at liberty to do so. But the key point, I think, as Clive was saying in all of this, is to get beyond simply numbers and data and get towards improvement. And that becomes, I say, the key focus of the project. We were conscious from the outside, again, it's in terms of what Clive was saying, strikes a similar chord. The danger here is you end up with league tables. When you publish some performance data, Council X is deemed to be the top, Council Y deemed to be the worst, etc., etc. The story behind all of that is obviously things are much more complex, much more sophisticated than that. So we knew that when we get the data together, how we analyse it, how we present it to the public is going to be important, because we're going to have to explain away complex issues rather than just simplistic issues at the end of the day. So what we'll do is give you an example of how that works in a minute or two. What we've had to do therefore with Solace is obviously working with 32 councils and all services. within the framework, try and work out a common interpretative process. How do we now collectively approach this data? What is this data starting to tell us about various councils and performance and so forth? And to read data in the round, not simply to look at the cost data in isolation from the performance data, in isolation from the customer satisfaction data, but to look at all of it together to try and get a rounded assessment of how different services are performing, and then make judgments about what is it within each of those services that's actually driving the high levels of performance that we can then identify. So we're trying to link all of those data sources together at the end of the day. We're also doing work with councils on a separate piece of work where we're building profiles for them with their areas and looking at the various social and other demographic factors. So what we'll do is bring that data source together with the financial and other data under benchmarking so that they've got a rounded understanding of their community as well as service performance as they make judgments here. And then lastly, a theme again worth exploring perhaps in the discussion groups. How do you now link all of this once you've got the data, etc., pulled together into genuine improvement activities so that it becomes part of the day job of services? It's not just a statistical exercise where we've collated data and lots of analysts are quite happy because we've got numbers to fling about the place, but it's genuinely helping improve services at the end of the day. To do that, I want to give you one example. I've taken, obviously, the names off the chart at this point. This is the 2010-11 data that relates to education spend. We've simply got here the cost per secondary pupil for all 32 councils, and the red line that runs across is the median for Scottish spend on pupils at secondary school. Median, by and large, is a better comparator to use than the average, than the mean, because it allows us to account for some of the outliers. But when you see a chart like that, it's actually very uninteresting. It doesn't tell you much. It just tells you that one council spends more than the rest. It doesn't explain why a council performs or spends more or less than another. So you need to dig into it to start to look at it. So I'll give you an idea of the kind of process that we're going through with all these indicators. First, let's knock out some of the high spends, just to see what impact does it have across the piece. Because there may be some authorities, and we could sit here and name them, but we don't have to, who, because of the nature of their community, end up spending much more on an individual service than would otherwise be the case. So if you knock them out, what does it do to the overall figures? Well, first of all, the range in terms of what councils spend decreases quite significantly, drops by just over 2,000, but the median figure only goes down by £103. So they're not having such a distortion effect that we might have initially assumed. So again, it starts to get us into a whole different series of questions once you start to break these figures down a wee bit. But spend is only one thing. Let's also look at educational performance simultaneously with the spend data. So if you spend more money, do you end up seeing better performance results? When you see the line there, the black line is the median again for educational performance. The blue jagged line is the education figures for the corresponding authorities. And again, what that starts to suggest is that there is no linear relationship between how much you spend and what your performance results are. So again, it starts to raise questions, and that was the whole point of this exercise from the outset, to get data to the basis where we can start to raise questions about council performance and explore it and start to truly understand what's going on and then share good practice off the back of that. So again, you see here peaks and troughs in terms of performance set against some of their figures. Let's pick out a couple of other ones. So what happens here is, if you take, again, the outliers out, does it have a material impact? Not hugely, because the educational performance doesn't shift, very much in line with what happens with the spend. But let's pick out two authorities here. One is a city authority, one is a suburban authority. And if you look at them, it starts to kind of point up some interesting things. First of all, one, the suburban authority, it's kind of high performance, but below median spend. The city authority, higher spend, below median performance. Now, the figures at this stage still don't explain why, but what they allow us to do is start to open up that can and explore in much more detail. What we need to start to look at, and what we're doing with Solus, is the underpinning factors of production. What is it the money gets spent upon, and does that in itself make a difference to the educational performance, etc.? So is it a case it's how you spend the money on your staff assets? Do you employ more teachers? Do you get better performance results? If you put more money into classroom support, classroom assistance, does that translate into better performance results? How do you use your estate, etc.? That starts to become an interesting question that we can explore with the different councils once we drill down into these figures. Another factor worth pointing up here is the impact now for some councils of CPP cost. We went down an approach a number of years ago where if you wished to renew your school estate, you had to go down a PPP route, public-private partnership. That now has cost for those councils who went down that particular route, and that shows through in some of their service spend. Now, those councils will argue that's an investment in education. We'll start to see performance results improve for children going forward. We can now work with those authorities and the others to try and test some of those assumptions as we go forward. So what this starts to get us towards is what are the genuine service issues, therefore things that we can focus on and improve, as opposed to some of the background issues. Because again, not surprisingly, being an urban and suburban authority, there are differences in terms of the social composition of the children and the communities that they come from, and that has an impact on the service. This starts to point us towards where and when does that truly matter for the service itself. What I've also done now is add another layer over across the top of this. This is educational performance broken down by SIMD, Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. And we've taken the kids at the bottom 15% by SIMD and look at their educational performance. And again, what you see is it broadly follows a similar trend to when we're looking at raw education data for all children. But again, it starts to raise some interesting questions of what's going on, not simply in the two authorities that we've got here on the screen, because if we take the City Authority, what's interesting is that when you look at the gap for its SIMD children, it's actually narrower than you may have assumed to begin with. So there's something going on at that level in some of the schools across this area that's now worthy of exploring. We would have assumed that that gap would have been down much further. So there's some good things happening in some schools. Let's now find out what they are and share that practice, not just across that authority, but beyond that authority into other councils as well. So again, the data is designed to start to facilitate, open up that kind of a process, that kind of a discussion. But equally, if we then just pick out a group of authorities similar in terms of its social demographics to the City Authority, again, you can see broadly similar trends, but different performance standards being achieved. So again, it licenses us to start to explore with those authorities what's truly going on, what are the factors of production that differ between you, do any of those relate to service improvement, service performance themselves? If so, what are they? How can we share and build them in to other services going forward? So that's the kind of process we're going through across all of the indicators with the councils to explore what sits beneath the data. What's going on that's about services and service failings and service performance improvements? What's simply, if you like, the background is the things that a council service has to absorb as part of its social catchment, etc. A couple of things to caution at the moment, though. This is snapshot data, and again, Clive was absolutely right in saying we should be wary about relying on snapshot. This is a one-year data, remember, for 2010-11. Tells us nothing about where each of those councils are in different investment cycles within their own services, what's been the trend spend, the trend performance. Could be the suburban authority that I put up simply had a great year in terms of exam results. So again, we have to go back and look at some of the past performance to understand where we are currently at the moment for each of those services. We need to be aware, as I say, of the difference makeup of the factors of production across different councils and now start to explore what impact are they truly having in service performance. The socio-economics of the community is important. We need to now explore where and why is it important and how can we work with communities in different ways to help develop improvement if that's appropriate. So you need to get below the council level. We need to, in education terms, start to look at the schools themselves and how things function at that level and understand what's going on and share some of the good practice around that. And that will be true of other service areas as well. The council consistency, to begin with through the framework, allows us now to target where do we drill down and to what level do we need to get to truly understand performance. And again, back to how we are ultimately going to report this. What's the story behind all of this? What do the numbers tell us? What is it that it's really saying about councils, their performance and so forth is something we have to think hard about. Because even on those half a dozen slides that I've stuck up, there's a very complex story there already. So how do we explain complexity? Not explain things away, but truly understand complex factors and account for that as part of our public performance reporting mechanisms. So a couple of issues, a couple of reflections to finish off in. In terms of data, we're strong on input and output data across local government, as indeed across most of the public sector. We need to improve outcome data, the difference that ultimately services are making to people in their lives, Trouble is that extends us into the partnership arena, not simply local government. Therefore, if we want to truly understand outcomes and their impacts that we are having on them, we need to go beyond local government as part of this exercise. That in itself will be complex, different systems, different data, different ways of defining things, purely on the technical, never mind some of the politics that will generate as well. There are also issues around time lag of data. As I say, we're working with 2010-11 as the base year, not because that's what we necessarily wanted to be doing, but because that's the most robust and accurate set of data we have because of the various processes we have to go through to get data into the public domain across the public sector. So there are things we can do to improve the time availability of data going forward. Secondly, we also have to think about, as I think as the committee is rightly doing, within that broader public service reform agenda that's taking place in Scotland, post-Christie in terms of the agendas that we're looking at. How do you disaggregate down to the lowest level to understand what's going on within communities? How do you genuinely take a hard outcome, a focused approach to service performance and so forth? So there are big questions around how does this now, as a project, take on board some of those messages? How do we work with other partners to help strengthen not just the Solace work, but potentially take this to work with other partners going forward? Thirdly, how do you engage the customer? How do you engage the service user? So we will publish towards the end of this year a consolidated report, for want of a better term, that looks across all 32 councils, what's going on, what are the kinds of issues that the data throws up. But when we publish that, hopefully members of the public will pick it up, they'll have a look at it, they'll understand better about what's going on in their area. But a couple of things to think about. Will they be interested? It'll be interesting to see what kind of a focus we get. I'm sure the red tops in the media will take some initial interest. What customers will eventually make of the information we'll have to test and make sure that we're getting it right. But even if we are, what can they then do? Are we licensing people to start passporting around who their service provider will be? I want to go to Council X, not Council Y. I mean, those types of issues. How empowered genuinely will the customer be at the end of the day across public services? A big question. What role for national government, and I dare say a body like the Parliament itself? Well, for national government, I think they can help to improve data working with local government. Get it timely, get it closer to live data, get it focused in ways that we need to support benchmarking going forward. But they also have to look at the broader performance landscape. How do we declutter some of that in order to create space for this to grow and evolve and develop and get embedded within local government? Because there are other competing, if you like, performance frameworks out there. We have to make judgments about what do we think are the most powerful ones and back them and support them and resource them, but also clear some of the space to allow them to grow properly. For local government, I suppose the responsibility here is, again, as Clive was saying, this is a self-assessment, self-evaluation road that we've chosen. We need to get that right. We need to continue to develop and grow and strengthen the framework as it goes forward. We need to work together to share learning, not just numbers and data, but good performance and why is the service performing well. And we need to be disciplined around that. And we need to grow confidence and develop confidence within the system that this is the correct approach. There are some risks in it, clearly. We're going to put information on a consolidated basis out into the public domain. It's a risk for some councils in terms of reputation and so forth. So far, all 32 are agreed that they'll continue to do that. But nevertheless, we need to help build confidence in councils that that is the right thing to do, back to Clive's theories of improvement. Public accountability here is a key driver of improvement. One of our jobs as local authorities is to facilitate that in order to get that dynamic within the system. So getting the system right, getting the culture right is going to be a big challenge for local authorities and sustaining the commitment to that. Because again, I absolutely agree with what Clive was saying. You have to sustain commitment to these types of approaches in order to get the payoff. They don't deliver overnight. You have to remain with them, back them, and continue to drive them forward. So that'll do from me, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Mark. If we could move on to the final speaker of the morning session, who is Andrew Stevens, Executive Director of the Local Government Data Unit in Wales. The Data Unit is part of the local government family in Wales. It provides a range of support to the Welsh Local Government Association, Welsh local authorities and their partners. Areas where the unit provides support and input include survey design and analysis, data collection, management and dissemination, performance measurement and management, benchmarking, and IT system development and support. Prior to moving to the data unit, Andrew held a variety of posts in the Office for National Statistics, including managing large data collections, statistical methodology and quality, and developing national statistics policies. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you very much to the committee for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'm going to touch on quite a lot of things that I think Mark and Clive have already talked about. I'm going to touch on quite a lot of things in quite a superficial way, but hope that we can pick up some of them later. What I really wanted to talk about is what the local government performance improvement framework looks like in Wales, how it operates in practice and what our role in the data unit is around that, some of the challenges and issues which will be common to some of the things that Clive and Mark have talked about, and also perhaps where we're going next, again, where I think there's some alignment with where you're going in Scotland. A little bit of context to start. We have a national devolved government as well. We have 22 unitary authorities, and our councils, our authorities vary significantly. We've got some small councils of around 55,000 population. We've got Cardiff with 340,000. We've got a number of rural authorities, and as Clive alluded to, we've got some city authorities. So we've got quite a varied landscape in terms of what the unitary authorities look like. And we've got what is a relatively new performance improvement framework. I've been in local government now for 9 years, and I think this is the third iteration of, we had 2 performance measurement frameworks, and now we've got a performance improvement framework. And I use the word iteration. They're not completely different change, and it's about developing them as we learn more, as we see what worked and didn't work, and there is some response in terms of that to devolution and the impact of that. So what does the local government performance improvement framework look like? It's got 3 tiers, really. At the top, we've got a set of national strategic indicators, which are owned, set in statute by the Welsh Government. And beneath those, we've got a set of what we call public accountability measures, which are owned by local government. And I've termed those as a set of indicators, measures, which are about holding local government to account. These are in the public domain. They're published. For example, we published the 2011-12 performance public accountability measures last Tuesday. That goes into the public domain with a short report published by my organisation with a press release and the data publicly available on our website. For example, then Wednesday morning, that meant a 2-page spread in the national daily newspaper of Wales, the Western Mail, picking up the indicators that they thought were of importance. And one of the things that we've already alluded to, we don't do a league table of authorities, but the Western Mail does. So it uses the set of indicators, it does some analysis on them, and I use that word because it changes each year, and it's not the way I do it if I was doing it, but that then ranks the 22 councils in Wales. And unfortunately, in the years that they've been doing it, which is several now, the same council always comes at the bottom on the methodology that you use. So, but those are the set of indicators that are out there in the public domain. And then sitting beneath that is a much larger set of what we call service improvement data. This is owned by local government, but we do have to do it in local government under the Welsh Government local government measure. We have to collect and benchmark our performance, collate data and benchmark our performance. It doesn't specify what we've got to do in terms of which indicators. It doesn't specify much about how we have to do it, but we are compelled to do it. So what we've got under there is a set of what we call service improvement data, which is a mixture of performance indicators, contextual data, the type of thing that Mark's talking about, population density differences, data from the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, and they're compartmentalised into service areas akin to the list that Mark put on for what you're proposing in Scotland. So that's what the framework looks like. I thought I'd try and touch on a little bit about how it actually works in practice. And I've started with by saying that it's still evolving. We haven't cracked it in Wales. I haven't come up here to tell you we've cracked it. And by the nature of us being on our third iteration of in the last 10 years, you can see that we are still evolving. What we do have in service areas already, in several service areas in local government, are well-established benchmarking clubs, which have operated for many years, regardless of the national framework, if you like, that's sat above them. What we're at the moment doing is, if you like, adding to that set as more service areas are taking benchmarking more seriously at the service level. One of the key things that has been required in order for this to happen is a culture change. When I moved into local government, there was a set of performance measures. There were, let's just say, 150 plus. And I would say that there was very little ownership for those in the service areas. Service areas work to develop them, but ownership of the performance and the reporting of it was often at the corporate centre in local authorities. And we've needed to work quite hard on the culture change of moving from performance measures and performance data being seen as in the hands and the role of the corporate performance leads in local authorities. If we're going to seriously change performance, it needs to be owned and part of the day-to-day job of the service managers, the service leaders in the service areas across local authorities. And that's something that we've spent quite a lot of time on over the last few years, working with the service areas to bring about that change. And it's not just the service areas that need to take ownership. It's also about the corporate centres in performance leads and corporate centres in authorities pushing that ownership and that and saying, you know, can we help you use this data to improve rather than give us data once or twice a year on how your performance, how your service is performing. As the Chair alluded to, the data unit is part of the local government family. We are a company limited by guarantee, but we're wholly owned by the Welsh Local Government Association. And that gives us a little bit of arm's length and in terms of the way we manage and look after data, and some independence in terms of integrity and the publishing of data. In terms of performance management and the framework, we sit right at the centre of that, providing a range of central support similar to what Mark alluded to, the improvement service in Scotland. Part of that is about development of the data sets, and you've talked about definitions, and definitions is important because you have to move away, if you really want service improvement, you have to move away from discussing the data definition and the data on to what does it mean, what are you doing better than me, how can I learn from you? And that means that you do have to put some work into getting the definitions right. We have, perhaps not as large as Clive described, the guidance in England previously, but we do have very detailed guidance on each of our indicators, and that includes both the ones that are in the public domain and definitions for some of the performance measures that are within the service improvement. And that's about getting the balance right. People, interestingly, if you leave it too loose, people ask you, you know, we've got a performance indicator helpline in my organisation where local authorities, if they want to know a little bit more about the indicators, what they should be collecting, can phone in. And they do want detail about what is it we should be collecting in there, how can we set up our systems to collect things that are comparable across authorities. So part of our role is about the definitions, about working with the service areas to understand what is it that's important in your what data do you need to manage, understand and improve your service. And then we work with them to put those sets together and to have definitions for that. We also have a role around collation and dissemination and sharing. And I'll come on a little bit more to that in terms of looking forward. But that's an important part. You need to make that as simple as possible. You don't want an industry. We have strived really hard over the last 2 or 3 years to try and bring the culture moving away from an industry of collecting and collating data to using that data to drive improvement. So we try to do what we can to make that collation and dissemination smooth and as possible. Also, increasingly, value-added analysis, the type of thing that was Mark was describing, the so what. We work, for example, some of the benchmarking clubs commission us to take the 2011-12 data, try and paint a picture with it, perhaps using contextual data, perhaps using other financial benchmarking data that's available, to say, so what is it telling us about our service, how it's moved forward, and where are the differences in performance across authorities. And then the other bit of our role is around supporting use locally. So that could be going in and working with a particular service to say, to look at their performance data, the performance data of others, and try and work out how they can actually improve service. It's not about the data, it's about moving from the data to how do we improve the service. Sometimes we bring high-performing authorities together with other authorities who are perhaps not performing as well, and try and get that engagement going. And what I want to describe to you now is just one example of how it actually works in practice. And I've used the word model, but I've taken this model from several of our benchmarking clubs working this way. And we've been recently doing some work, well, it's in its second year now, some work with a subset of the local authorities in Wales on children's services. I'll use this model to describe what they did in terms of service improvement and benchmarking. The first thing is about this safe environment. And I'm sure that we'll have discussions about the role of the media, the role of regulators, and the public and private question. But what we did was we got together a set of service leads, service managers from the 6 authorities who were really interested in moving forward some of the service delivery in children's services. But we brought them together in what we called a safe environment. There was us as facilitators and the 6 authorities. And we had a lot of debate about then, do you bring in the regulators? So now for children's services, that's the inspectorate body, who probably have something quite valuable to bring to the table in terms of where we should be putting our priorities. And so we did bring the regulators in, but it was still this safe environment. What we did then was have a look at what was the benchmarking data telling us, and we chose 12 key performance indicators around children's services, and used those 12 to have a look at what they were telling us. Now, we started by understanding any of the data issues. Are we all collecting the same thing? Are we comparing apples and oranges, apples and pears, or are we actually comparing apples? And you have to go through some of that discussion before you can move on to so what. So we did some work around that, and there were issues where people were measuring things at different points in the process, and then we had to do in some cases, some reworking. Some authorities say, if I really need to understand my performance, I need to look at my data again and perhaps rework it so it's a bit more comparable with everybody else's. And then you move on from the data to then, so what are the real differences in service performance? And then you can start to talk about, well, how are you doing that? What do you do? Have you got some processes? Have you got Have you learnt from others? And what do you do? And what can we, some of us less efficient or less effective in some areas, authorities do to learn? And what's interesting is that you'll find some people are at the top on some indicators, not surprisingly, and others on others. And so there's actually quite a good learning. It's not all one-way traffic. And then even in that environment, it wasn't just about going back to their authorities. In that group, some of those who saw they had a way to go actually put forward some of the things they were going to do to improve their performance locally in that group. And that group then has continued to meet roughly about every 4 or 5 months over a period of 15, 18 months now. So that's how some of the service improvement data is, if you like, used in anger. I want to pick up some of the, and touch on some of the issues and challenges we face. Data quality. Mark alluded to this. You do actually have to have data that is comparable. Otherwise, you'll spend all your time arguing about the data. One of the things that was really interesting, we reached a point about 2 years ago where the Chief Executive of the Welsh Local Government Association made a statement when he was asked in our press briefing on the day of release of the data. He said, well, once it's in the public domain, that's the data. And that's quite powerful in a way, because you then stop having the arguments about the data then and using that as your excuse for your performance locally, if that's, and you move on to what are you going to do about it. But nevertheless, data quality is an issue. I would say that what we've noticed in Wales is it's the biggest driver of data quality is use. If it's actually used, then it improves. And that's one of the drivers of the culture change, because, you know, in some cases, data was being passed to the corporate centre ahead of publication, and the service areas didn't worry about it again, and they weren't really challenged. They were challenged if suddenly it was in front of the chief exec and they were the worst performer in Wales or in the bottom quartile. But if you're in the middle quartile, you know, I've passed that performance data on, no one's questioned me about it, not used again, was it right? Or so use. The other thing is, what does quality mean? And there's, if it's in the public domain, then there is a sense that it needs to be as right as you can get it. And some of our data goes through the auditors before it's published. But there's also this idea of it being good enough in terms of for service benchmarking, and we've started using that quite a lot. If it's good enough to have that initial dialogue in that, then that's okay. Let's not spend ages and ages on definitions. If it's good enough for us to have that initial dialogue about understanding service performance, then that's okay. And so, but that tension then on quality comes through then when you talk about public and private, and I've already mentioned culture, and culture continues to be an issue. It's about making ownership for the data with the people who are delivering the service, and that's something that's ongoing, public or not. That is a real tension. We've got quite a small set now which are in the public domain, but under FOI, any of it could be in the public domain. There's also about, we've been talking with the Welsh Government about if you want to work in partnership to deliver a service improvement, people outside the local government family have to have access to some of that data. Mark's already alluded to, I mean, in Wales we've got local service boards that are responsible, that, you know, that are cross-agency boards responsible for delivering key cross-agency improvement. They need to have access to a range of data that some of which sits in local government. And so it's getting that balance right, and then the tensions that that brings with the openness, the honesty, the sharing, the quality, all of that. Linked to that is the role of the regulators. We've got both the Wales Audit Office and obviously the regulators for individual services like Estyn for schools. And how do you utilise the skills, experience that they've got to help you in performance improvement at the same time as understanding that they're a regulator. And for example, when we worked with the Children's Services, what we did, we actually had a data sharing agreement with the regulators so that we would share the data with them, but it wasn't about them then suddenly, it wouldn't be right for a service manager to be sharing and be open in that environment with the regulators and then suddenly find that the chief exec had a letter from the regulator saying your service is not good enough in that area. The other challenge for us is beyond Wales, and we've already alluded to that. We've got cities, as Clive said, and their natural comparators may not be in Wales also. Even if you're a rural authority, if you're in the top quartile and you want to benchmark for excellence, where and who do you go to? And we've been doing some work, and the sets of comparable data are limited. And it will be a challenge to think about how we manage as a UK to perhaps bring some consistency to allow us to do some of that, at least at levels that help us in some of the key service areas. We're next, further development of the indicator set. Picking up on one of the challenges that Mark said, it's about we've got to keep those sets relevant, because what we don't want to do is to have other sets of or frameworks coming along which detracts from this the key framework that we're working to. So we need to keep that framework and make sure it's aligned with key priorities at the moment, with Welsh Government priorities, local government priorities. We also have the same challenge. We have got quite a lot of process measures. We've been very good at measuring processes, less so, particularly in some service areas, on measuring outcomes. That's a challenge, but we need to develop more outcome measures. A whole range of challenges goes with that, particularly since some of the outcomes, you don't see the improvement in the short term. It needs medium-term investment to get that. And we've got a whole programme of service area development. We then, encouraging and supporting use. We've still got the culture thing, which we're still moving forward. More around the value-added analysis. We do need to do more on that. One of the things that we've just released is a new benchmarking hub, and I'm hoping I'll just be able to just touch to show you that, and I would be happy to talk to others separately about that. And then frequency. We've just published the 2011-12 data, but some of that's about performance in April 2011. Are there some indicators? Why are we benchmarking? Well, in some cases, we're benchmarking to understand our performance right now. And so are there some sets of indicators that we might want to start collecting and sharing quarterly? And so that's an area where we're moving to now. And I just briefly want to, if this works, which it might, to show you something that you talk about how you disseminate it, how you disseminate the data, and this is going to be, I didn't expect to have to do this backwards. We've got what we call a benchmarking hub, and you won't be able to read it here, but this is this key thing about sharing the data. This is available on to all local authorities. They do have to register, but to all local authorities and to people outside, subject to their registration. But this gives them access to the Benchmarking Club data to try and facilitate use. I But what they are told up front is that you can use this data, you can use your local authority data publicly, you can use the Wales averages publicly or the quartiles publicly, but you can't use any other local authorities' data to publish without the express permission of them. So, but if I just give you an example here on children's services, and it picks up. We've developed this, and I appreciate that people won't be able to see it, but what you've got here is access to the annual data for that service by indicator. You've got access to the data over time, which is picking up on a lot of our data sets. We've got a series. You've got, and this is the one I just wanted to pick up and see if it'll load the data. And this should be the 11-12 data. And I can pick an authority here, and here you've got a basket of measures, because often it's not sensible to look at one measure in isolation. Here we've got a basket of measures. Green is the top quartile, red is the bottom quartile of performance, and the blue line here tells this authority, which in this case is Powys, how is it doing in terms of this basket of measures. So at an instant you can actually see, well, actually we're doing reasonably well here, and they can compare themselves with Wales. And perhaps if I just show you one other, which is and the idea of this tool is to try and give authorities a tool to help them use the data in a way they're likely to want to use it locally. So if I choose a different one, I'm not going to be able to see the indicator set from here, but you can choose any one of the indicators by year. And you can start to look at how are we doing compared to other authorities, and change years. And on one of the other ones too, you can actually look at how performance across the authority, similar diagram to the bar chart to the one Mark showed, but actually showing how performance changes over a 10-year period. And all of this data is able to be extracted and into JPEGs and put into reports. And for us too, it happens to be important that they can get hold of this data quickly. And that's really all I wanted to say, but just to give you a flavour, I hope, of some of the things that we're doing in Wales. As I say, we haven't cracked it, but we are making significant progress, I think.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Andrew is the final speaker of the morning, and we'll now move into a question and answer session. Not only will we be having questions from within the room, but we will also be taking questions by tweet, I believe. The event is being webcast, and I'm sure that we're making a major dent in the viewing figures of Jeremy Kyle in this morning. If you wish to ask a question, could you please wait for the roving mic to get to you if you're in the back row, and could you also state your name and which organisation you're representing today. Maybe I'll start the ball rolling by asking Mark a question. You mentioned reputation during the course of your presentation. Elected members are always particularly worried about reputation and quite often have not been quite so open and transparent and have been a little bit scared of some of the work that's being done. Are we overcoming that?
I suppose the short answer is time will tell. Certainly when we've taken the developments of the framework to COSLA leaders to let them see it and discuss it with them, we've had nothing but backing from them. So all of the major parties represented through COSLA are consistent in their support to the project. So I think you're starting to see members saying, yes, we want to know how do we compare against other areas in Scotland. That's always been part of my experience of working with councillors. Now what they're also saying is that that should also be in the public domain simultaneously. So I think you are seeing that change take place. No doubt there will be some political games that will take place in the months ahead when it finally goes into the public domain, but that's part of life. We just need to get on with it, move on with it, and grow up quickly around about that. But certainly what we're getting from the elected members is that this is a positive development that they support.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I'm not quite sure if you're controlling it or not. You are. Okay. Any hands? All very quiet. David.
Just to give people some more thinking time for questions. I'm just wondering, and this is... Sorry, I've broken
Name
code.
and
Of course I
organisation.
have. I'll be getting real trouble from my previous bosses here. David Cullum, I'm clerk to the Local Government Committee. This question is really, I suppose, for Dr Clive Grace and Andrew Stevens, either of you. I'm just wondering if this is nothing more than the latest fad, and whether there are any examples where it has improved performance.
Yes, I think the evidence in Wales is that we've had a fairly consistent approach, albeit with slightly different iterations of the framework, for the last 10 years, and we've had the data in the public domain, at least some of it, for the last, I think, 6 years we've produced. So I don't think it's a fad. And in terms of has it made a difference, I think there are examples. I can give you examples of a number of indicators in Wales where in the public domain the Minister has often criticised the ranges of performance between the best and and worst local authorities, and I've seen performance in at least one of those the range half over the last 3 to 4 years. So that's around public scrutiny. And obviously, too, then, in terms of local benchmarking, I can give you examples in children's services of process improvement and service delivery improvement. So I wouldn't say it was a fad. It's not a fad in Wales. It's not one that we're about to drop.
Clive?
There's no doubt that it can make a significant difference. For whatever people thought of comprehensive performance assessment in England, all the evidence, political, administrative, service delivery, is that it made a very significant difference indeed. What's slightly faddish about it is the terminology. Is people talk about benchmarking now in the way they used to talk about performance indicators. So there's a slight fashion element around the terminology, but not around the underlying issue. And you've only got to ask yourself actually the counterfactual. The counterfactual is, can you improve your services if you don't know how you're doing and you don't know how you compare with others? It's a no-brainer, really.
Okay, thank you, Clive. We have a question through on Twitter from Eileen Gill, who's the director owner of EG Perspectives. The question is for Andrew. Do you have any specific examples where data has been used to make improvement in service that has led to improved outcomes? You've touched upon that in children's services. Yes. Can you give others?
Yeah, and I can give you another example. Is the provision of Disabled Facilities Grant. Disabled Facilities Grant is a grant given by local authorities, as it says, for individuals to improve their home to allow them to maintain independent living. And in some cases, years ago, that grant was taking a couple of years to deliver in many authorities. It was measured in numbers of days, and I can remember authorities where the number of days to deliver that grant was over 2 years. And there was a significant range between the best and worst performers. And it was one that a previous Welsh Government minister mentioned in the press briefing on the morning of the release of the performance indicators, and mentioned it several times over the coming months. And clearly that had an impact on local authorities, and I believe now that it's probably halved there are still some authorities taking quite a long time to deliver that, but performance has significantly improved since discussion of that performance indicator was in the public domain.
Thank you. Margaret?
Local government member. First of all, thank you all for your presentations, and can I say it's encouraging from our point of view that at least we seem to be taking or looking at benchmarking within the right context, i.e. the reform of public services. I have two questions specifically, one to Andrew. You mentioned ownership, and that does seem to me absolutely crucial. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you've taken people along with you and encouraged them to have ownership? And for Clive, perhaps you could elaborate more on, for great benchmarking, it requires political self-discipline, maybe a little bit more on exactly what that entails.
Andrew?
I think one of the key things that we did around moving ownership from the corporate centre to the service areas was around splitting our indicator set into those which are public accountability measures, which were the key indicators anyway, which a service would understand, and then the service improvement data, which is data about managing and improving the service and pushing the responsibility totally for that to the service areas. So, for example, in defining what that set is, we bring together the service managers, so in social services it could be directors of children's services, together with the business managers for children's services, together to define what that set is. What is it you need to manage your business? And on the service improvement data, that is voluntary. We sharing that data amongst the 22 authorities is voluntary. We say, if it's not contextual data or data that's already available, don't collect it unless it's of some use to you. You don't. So therefore, it's actually saying bring together the data that helps you in your authority manage and benchmark your services. Clearly, you'll be held to account by auditors or whatever if you aren't actually managing your service effectively. But it's about saying it's your responsibility to decide what it is you need. We'll give you a broad set of defined indicators, but if one of them doesn't work for you, don't spend time collecting and collating it. But there's quite a few of them where you'd expect to be held to account if you weren't. So it is, and it's also then this idea about helping them use it, because they own it when they're using it. They didn't own it when all they did was collect it and send it to somebody in the corporate centre. So we try and get the collection of it too from the services and not from the corporate centre.
I suppose as well as ownership, I'm thinking a little bit about, I suppose it is the culture, so it doesn't look as though it's all criticism. They see a positive, and ownership is buying into it in terms of seeing a way forward and how it will improve.
And it is this, it's not that collection and what it says on that day, it's about what you do with it and those people all coming together. It's quite easy with 22 authorities and a fairly small country to bring groups together. And it is about that safe environment where it's not about criticism, but it's about, do you know, I'm the worst in Wales at this, how can I be better? What are you doing? And having that discussion in that right environment. And that's a lot, so it's this difference between holding to account and benchmarking for service improvement. And I mean, there is still obviously a bit of the criticism around the public indicators where authorities are not performing particularly well. But the majority of it, which is in the service improvement area, it's about working together to deliver improvement, not about we're doing better than you.
Clive, tremendous political self-discipline.
Well, I think there are two aspects I suppose I would pick out of this. One is that good politicians are hungry for change and they're hungry to see things done. And along with that, inevitably often goes a sense of impatience and sometimes frustration. And those aspects don't sit particularly well, or may not sit particularly well, with developing a benchmarking system which has the support of stakeholders, which is properly embedded, which is allowed to mature, and where you've got a good degree of political consensus. And that's the other aspect, I suppose, I would pick out. Possibly not so much in the devolved nations, but certainly within the UK there is a great temptation for public services and public service performance to be a political football. And that's inevitable, and it's quite fair and reasonable at one level, because that's one of the things politicians are responsible for, and there should be robust political debate around it. Trying to conduct that whilst recognising that there are underlying processes of change, of improvement, of measurement and assessment. Those are two very different cultures. That, you know, the culture of political debate and the culture of doing all of that don't sit comfortably together, or they haven't sat comfortably together. Maybe the way that your committee is going about this kind of development is taking that contradiction by the horns, really, and trying to resolve it and get beyond it. And if you succeed, then I think you will have broken some very significant fresh ground in UK public services and political debate.
Thank you. John?
Thank you, Chair. Probably like David, you know, I sometimes get a wee bit cynical with regards to, you know, why now? And, you know, has it been driven because of, you know, the times of austerity, you know, where, you know, hard decisions are sometimes having to be made, but I'm also totally behind that there always a requirement for continuous improvement. And sometimes I think part of my cynicism is that, you know, we find ourselves, you know, looking at reports, you know, from people like yourself, Dr. Clive, and from Alec, where, you know, our committee clerk, who are saying that this is something that has to be done, bearing in mind that your background was previously, you know, as chief executives of councils, you know, and so you can, you know, you wonder why in that respect. As I say, but I'm all for benchmarking, but even when we get to the stage where we've done the analysis and you know, the benchmarking has been where we're able to identify good performing councils and not good performing councils, and for, you know, saying it's always a continuous improvement. You know, and I think I go back to Andrew, who would appear that Wales are perhaps, you know, a stage or two further on than what we are in Scotland. But the alarm bells come out when you know, you do your league table and you find that the worst performing council, even after going through all the benchmarking analyses and issues, is still at the bottom of the league table. So, you know, is benchmarking really working? Or the fact that, you know, least performing council in Wales has been shown continuous improvement, but because those who they were trying to benchmark against is continually improving, you know, when did they ever go off the bottom of the, you know, the bottom of the pile, if you know what I mean? But I think the reality is that, you know, benchmarking, I think, is probably here with us, and, you know, and I think the committee has signed up that we want to make sure that, you know, something does come from it. But I think, like David, you know, people always have to play the devil's advocate to try and extract, if you like, you know, the real issues.
Let's go to Clive. The bottom of the pile and remaining bottom of the pile, is it worth it?
I think the critical thing here is that when you design your system, and I said, you know, don't make it one tight, you know, one-size-fits-all system, but when you design your system, make sure that you've looked at it in the round, and in particular, in the context of your question, it would be this. I would want to make sure that we put the right amount of effort and resource into the value-added work that Mark and Andrew both referred to. In other words, you don't want to put 95% of your time, effort, energy into generating the data and the comparisons and so forth, and leave yourself no resource, no instruments to then do something with it, i.e. do the more detailed understanding of why a council is at the bottom of on a particular issue and how they need to improve and change and move on. So I think you want to balance it and make sure that you've got the data sets are good, the comparisons are good, the authoritative interpretation is good, you've got a basis for action in response to that, you've got an understanding of how you think improvement will take place, and you've got a way of showing people and taking them to that point. And so, in that sense, the development of the benchmarking system that Mark has been describing, I would say is critically important, but is maybe 25%, 30% of what you need to do, because those other stages, the added value stuff and then helping people change, has to be there as well. And Audit Scotland have got in my view, a big role to play in this particular part of it.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back, white shirt and glasses.
Hello, it's Adam Stewart from COSLA. I think, first of all, just to say, really looking forward to this project and the detailed considerations that come after this discussion about how to avoid any unintended consequences that perhaps plagued similar approaches over the last couple of iterations. In terms of a specific question this time round, it's really about this issue of local variation and legitimate local variation that's reflected in democratic choice and control locally. Is there a risk in terms of benchmarking that you lose some of that local legitimacy in terms of choice and control? And if so, how can you minimise that risk?
Okay. Shall we go to Andrew first on that one?
I think there is a risk. There's our role nationally, and there will always be people in the bottom quartile. There'll always be a league table. So nationally, our role is to paint. We paint a picture of how many of the indicators that are comparable year on year have improved, and every year, for the last 3 years, that's been over a third of them. How many of those indicators has the range narrowed? So, and that's what we're looking nationally. But what we also do is we give local authorities access to the data that we're going to publish 5 days before, including access to the leaders and the chief execs. We write to the leaders and the chief execs 5 days before we release the data so that they have access and understand. And that is primarily to encourage them to put forward their own press releases at time of publication, to put the local context. You know, if, for example, children's services haven't improved at all in X authority, then that authority might say, well, we were already in the top quartile and our priority this year has been education, and you'll see this is where you've seen the shift. So I think it's about, provided the authority understands its performance, and that's the important thing, if it understands its performance, and that's members and officers, and then they can put their local context alongside of that, which will be our priority has been. Because, you know, they should, if the policy has been based on evidence, then the performance indicator set is part of that evidence base on which they decided their policy locally. So it should be able to put their local context and their local indicators together and tell the story of what's important locally. Okay. Mark and then Clive.
Yeah, just briefly add to some of what Andrew's saying. I suppose a part for the SOLACE project is to capture as part of the discussion what is it that a council is seeking to achieve through its services. Now, most service areas, we're all trying to achieve something similar, but there are variations around that. And it's what's the emphasis in terms of local policy that a council attaches to services that you have to make sure you capture. So it's maybe that I'm not performing worse than you, I'm just trying to seek something slightly different from you, and that has to be acknowledged through the exercise. Because what you don't want to assume is that in every single service and in every single instance, all councils are seeking exactly the same, because they're not. They respond to the needs of their local communities and population, and that has to be factored into the exercise too, so that you genuinely recognise difference as part of it. If it's not about difference, but it's about performance, different matter entirely, then that's where you kick in the improvement process. But if I'm seeking something different from you, from the service, for my community, because it is different from yours, that's perfectly legitimate.
Clive?
So also briefly, first of all, I think this question about these processes encouraging local politicians to articulate the policy choices they're making is absolutely critical. My experience of local government is that, you know, frankly, that process is often quite patchy. I think often politicians at local level don't appreciate some of the choices they have, and that's because they're not as well as advised by their officers as they should be. But knowing better what those choices are and being able to take them is one thing. The second is if you think about that list I put up earlier, economy, efficiency, effectiveness and excellence, it seems to me that there is real choice, real grounds for choice around the two ends of that spectrum, economy and excellence. You can decide if you want, as a local politician, that you want cheap services. That's a decision. You may or may not, but it's a decision you're entitled to make. And some authorities make it. For example, in the social care field, you know, that's a choice that people have made for good or ill. You can also decide you're going for excellence, and that's fine too. But it does seem to me that there's much less room for choice around the questions of efficiency and effectiveness. It seems to me those are core duties for all public services. The good use of resources, whatever they're applied to, and effectiveness in terms of relating what you do to some kind of appropriate outcome. And I'd hold all to that, and I don't think there's nearly as much choice in those areas as there is at the two ends of that particular little spectrum.
Thank you. Any other questions? No. Right, thank you. We are a little behind schedule, but we'll now move into breakout groups. And I suggest that we have a 10-minute comfort break and start the breakout groups proper at 11:30. You will notice that you have a number on your name badge. That number refers to the breakout group you will take part in. Those in Group 1 will remain in this room. Group 2 will be in Committee Room 6. Group 3 will be in Committee Room 5. And Group 4 will be in Room P102. Events assistants will escort you to the relevant room, and you're invited to follow them. So, Group 1 here, Group 2 in Committee Room 6 across the way. Who's taking Group 3 to Room 5? I think, yep. And Group 4, P102. Okay. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you later on in the day.